we'll go through some introductions, and then we'll start the first part of the training today, and then we'll come back to more of a deeper dive topics and review of some local sites. So to let you know who is going to be talking to you today from VHB team, on behalf of Federal Highways, I'm Luba Zuva presenting for you today from VHB Charlotte office. I've certainly enjoyed my trip to Nashville in the past. I hope to get a chance to come back again soon. I'm also supported by Logan Newsom, who is with us, and he's going to help moderate the Q&A. And so if you add any questions or comments to the chat box, he'll help to make sure that we see the comments that come in. Becky Crow with Federal Highways is listed on the contact information there. She's overseeing this this element of the program, the STEP Pedestrian Safety series of technical workshops. So she's not with us today, but you can always reach out to Becky if you have some specific follow-up questions, or maybe you know of additional regions that might benefit from similar workshops. We do have Peter Yoon with us with Federal Highways today. Peter, if you want to say hello.
In Davidson counties.
Yes, hi, and I am the co-lead with the Resource Center. I often go out do the technical assistance, and so I'll be sitting in and helping out where I can.
Thank you, and love the t-shirt idea. Hoping to see that implemented in real life. And then from the local team, let's see, we have Daniel with us today with the MPO. Daniel, if you don't mind introducing yourself, and your co-presenter, Ashley.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name is Daniel Caparella, an active transportation planner for GNRC. Ashley Reeves, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, I'm Ashley Reeves. I'm one of the senior research analysts with GNRC, and I'll be talking to you about local trends today.
Thank you both. And then from Tennessee DOT, we have Rochelle Carpenter and also Patrick Dolan. Rochelle, if you want to say hello, if you're here with us today.
Hello, everybody. This is Rochelle Carpenter with TDOT, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the pedestrian safety trends along with Patrick and Ashley, but also some of the initiatives that TDOT is working on to improve pedestrian safety in your region and others.
Thank you. And Patrick, if you want to say hello to the group also.
Sure, I'm Patrick Dolan. I work for the Department of Safety and Homeland Security. I manage their statistics office, and we are the owners of the statewide crash database. So I'll be going over some trends in pedestrian motor vehicle crashes, their involvement, and the characteristics of those crashes today.
Great, thank you. And if any of you need to get a hold of somebody who's a speaker today whose name is not listed on here, feel free to reach out to Daniel. He can help put you in touch with the right person also. So just as a reminder, as already mentioned, if you've joined us, please put your name and agency in the chat box so we can keep an accurate record of attendance. And that means that if you want to register for PDH credits on your own later, you have that record of attendance. Also, feel free to add some of the things that motivate you to join this workshop today, maybe some thoughts you have about pedestrian safety needs in this region. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So again, today our program is about 2 hours long. We're supposed to go till, I believe, 1 p.m. Central. It's going to be 2 p.m. for Eastern time in Charlotte. Let's see, just a little bit of logistics. Again, by default, you are able to unmute yourself, and there's also the chat box function. So when we have those opportunities to pause and discuss, feel free to speak up or add your comment to the chat box if that feels more convenient with the flow of the conversation. And with that, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to STEP and then turn it over to our local team to review some of the local trends and data. So a little bit of an introduction to what is Everyday Counts EDC program with Federal Highways. So that's kind of the umbrella program under which Federal Highways STEP, Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian, the series of workshops resides under this umbrella of Everyday Counts. So Everyday Counts is a state-based model to identify and rapidly deploy innovative treatments that have been proven to have to be very effective in certain areas, whether to shorten the project delivery process, improve roadway safety, reduce congestion, or improve environmental sustainability. So under the CDC program, there's a new series of topics that are selected every couple of years. So STEP was actually part of the 5th round of EDC during 2019-2020, but there was enough of a demand for those STEP pedestrian safety workshops that they've continued into 2021, and we're getting ready to wrap them up in the summer of 2021. So we're kind of operating under an extension of this 5th cycle of EDC, even though the 6th cycle has already started with a different series of topics. And then why are we talking about pedestrian safety, and why is it such an important topic? If any of you look at the news or read some of the crash data and statistics updates, you probably have seen that there has been this huge increase in pedestrian crashes and fatalities over the last 10 years. And it can also be applied more generally to active transportation users. But for pedestrians especially, they represent about 11% of overall trips that are made in the US, but at the same time, they represent about 17% of all roadway fatalities as of 2018. So there's definitely this disproportionate impact to pedestrians who are walking on our streets and sidewalks. People are unfortunately not experiencing safe pedestrian conditions, and this trend is not getting better. The trend is actually getting worse, where again, we're seeing this increase in pedestrian crashes, and especially pedestrian crashes resulting in fatalities and serious injuries, disproportionately versus what we were seeing for the general trends. You might have seen that on average, there's a lot of improvements in our roadway safety because the vehicles have gotten so much safer. When you are inside this car protective bubble, there have been some benefits due to safety improvement features included in the new cars, but at the same time, on the active transportation user side, we're not seeing those benefits. And there's even some anecdotal evidence that over the last year during COVID pandemic, even though people were driving less during the first half of 2020, for example, people were actually speeding more because there was this perception that there's nobody out there. So in some ways, speeding on the roadways might have even increased the crashes in some areas. So with that, again, just this general introduction that increase in pedestrian crashes and fatalities is this troubling trend. And then I'm going to turn it over to the local team to review some of the more local statistics. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Rochelle, the Tennessee DOT. And Rochelle, I can advance the slides for you when you're ready.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me pull this up. So thank you everybody for joining today. And I have some slides in here on pedestrian crash factors, but I understand that Patrick and Ashley are going to be going over those as well after me. So I will keep these first few slides shorter than usual. You can go to the next one. So today I really do want us to be thinking about solutions. And oh, sorry, I'll turn my camera on. Hello. Hello. Certain specific solutions to these pedestrian crashes and specific locations where we could use the 7 designs that we're going to be going over today. So as I wrote here on slide 7, or the 7 infrastructure designs of FHWA's STEP program, which we call countermeasures, are proven to reduce pedestrian crashes. So please, throughout the day, today and tomorrow, please take notes if you think of intersections, streets, or other locations where we could install this infrastructure, and share them with us later today. I also didn't realize this until recently. The United States has the highest rate of traffic fatalities compared with all other high-income countries, with more than 40,000 per year, which is astonishing, and we'll get more into the statewide and regional trends. Go ahead to the next slide. So, yeah, a bit more about the Dangers by Design report, which Smart Growth America just released about a couple months ago, showing that Tennessee has the 12th highest pedestrian fatality rate in the country. So the Nashville region actually has a high pedestrian fatality rate compared with all highly populated cities in the US. So again, we really do need to be thinking about where to install the very effective pedestrian safety designs we're going to be discussing in detail throughout the day and tomorrow. Go ahead to the next slide. I won't spend much time on this, particularly since I'm pretty sure Patrick already has an updated slide since this is already from 6 months ago. But just keep in mind that our pedestrian fatalities and non-motorist fatalities, including bicyclists, have been increasing since 2012. And 171 people were killed on our roadways in 2020, our highest year ever. Next. So Ashley's going to be talking more about the regional crashes, but there were about 2,500 crashes with pedestrians in 5 years and about 750 with bicyclists. That is a lot of people. So please, let's be thinking about how the very specific infrastructure designs we're going to be talking about today can be installed on our streets to prevent those thousands of crashes. Next. How our roadways are designed has a strong impact on the safety and comfort of people who are walking and bicycling. So this includes characteristics such as travel lanes, or how wide those travel lanes are, how much and how fast traffic is traveling. Emerging research at TDOT is even showing that the majority of our pedestrian fatalities in our state is occurring on state roads. I think it's also important to know the role of speed. So this map is showing the roadways with speed limits across Region 3. Pedestrians struck by a car at 20 miles an hour have a 90% chance of survival, while those struck at 50 miles per hour only have a 10% chance of survival. State routes, as you well know, typically have speed limits of 40 miles per hour and greater. So we do, as part of these designs, should be thinking about how to slow traffic down and be observant of pedestrians. All right, next slide. So TDOT has taken a lot of steps to integrate safety for people who are biking and walking. In a lot of ways, starting with a multimodal access policy that's been adopted and used throughout the department. You can see it here, first adopted in 2010, so about 10 years old now, 10 and a half. And it has translated since then into, go ahead to the next slide, some very specific policies and grant programs, such as the Multimodal Access Grant Program, which is it's organized by the multimodal team at TDOT and gives you opportunities to apply for pedestrian or bicyclist safety infrastructure at $1 million. The Transportation Alternatives Program was already in place. That's using federal funding before the Multimodal Access Grant Program, but it's also a really good source for pedestrian safety infrastructure funding, and that is run by TDOT's local programs office. Next slide. TDOT recently, probably 4 years ago, adopted these multimodal design guidelines. So for every project that is in development, TDOT staff are looking at bicyclist and pedestrian needs on each and every roadway to determine for these new projects what the appropriate infrastructure for walking and bicycling is, and add those into projects from the beginning, which has really made a lot of improvements in the projects that are coming out from TDOT from the start. Go ahead to the next slide. These are the most dangerous corridors for walking in Region 3. So these are streets where we're seeing the highest pedestrian crashes. Darker blue is the highest, lighter blue the lowest, but still very high compared with the rest of the state. And we at TDOT are using our Highway Safety Improvement Program funds to prioritize pedestrian safety infrastructure on our most dangerous corridors for walking. So there's actually about 10 in Nashville where we are actively working on pedestrian safety designs throughout the city, including Murfreesboro Pike, Gallatin, Nolensville Pike, and several others. Go to the next slide. Most of you are probably aware too that TDOT is about to wrap up our statewide active transportation plan, which we have named Making Connections, Actions to Improve Walking, Bicycling, and Rolling in Tennessee. So this is not going to be a list of projects to improve pedestrian and bicycle safety. Instead, it's mostly taking a look at processes internally at TDOT so that we can more seamlessly develop pedestrian and bicycle safety designs and infrastructure throughout the department, throughout TDOT, with the thousands of staff. So we've taken a couple years to really look at how we interact with MPOs and local agencies and transit agencies and RPOs in order to, and internally. So every department that has anything to do with a walking and bicycling project, we have talked to and received input for and are making several really strong recommendations about how to improve the process to deliver pedestrian and bicycle safety projects. So that'll be really exciting. Next slide. All right, finally, just to get us thinking again about these particular designs. So these designs, they work. This improvement, which I'm sure you all know about, cost very little money, a total of about $50,000, and it prevented about 20 people from being hit in a year. It also was installed very quickly in just a few months. So this design here uses 3 of the 7 step infrastructure designs that we're going to be going over in detail: a highly visible crosswalk, a pedestrian refuge island, and a rectangular rapid flashing beacon. In addition to offering more actual protection to pedestrians, the design sent an alert to drivers to pay attention here. And they did. It was fascinating to watch traffic slow down as it approached this area when this design was installed. This was temporary. It has been taken down, and there is a traffic light here. But I think we're looking to install these same kinds of designs at appropriate places throughout Nashville because it was so effective and cost effective. I think that's it. I'll just wrap up to say, please keep thinking of those specific places where we can place these really effective designs and save lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle. And at this point, Daniel, are you going to be presenting next, or do we need to turn it over to some of the dashboard metrics?
I believe it'll be Patrick for the
Patrick. Great. So Patrick, I'm going to stop sharing and let you pull up your slides then.
Okay. Let's start here. Okay, I should be sharing a dashboard.
Yep, we can see it. Thank you.
Wonderful. So, hi everybody, I'm Patrick. As I said earlier, I manage the statistics office for the Department of Safety and Homeland Security, and I'm going to go over some of our trends in pedestrians involved in motor vehicle crashes. Most of this stuff comes from the dashboards that are available on our website, so I would encourage you to visit those if you have additional questions. And we have some also some GIS resources out there too that I'm going to look at. This first slide is just our current state of traffic fatalities in Tennessee. We're up 370, we're up by 25%, 75 over last year, the same time last year. The good news for this program is that while we still have too many pedestrian fatalities, they are not up year to date. They're pretty much even where they were from last year. If you can see here, we have 42 so far in 2021 and 44 last year. While we've seen a large increase in fatalities overall, that's been almost entirely driven by motor vehicle occupants. So while we all want to drive pedestrian fatalities down and 42 is already too many, we're kind of on track to be even or hopefully lower than we were last year already. So the trend looks okay for this year, better than it has in the past couple of years. And speaking of that, if we go over here to the fatality history, I saw that we've already gotten a look at this chart today, but as was pointed out in the last presentation, our fatalities have been increasing almost year over year, with one exception, since 2012 in non-motorist fatalities. And this is just pedestrians, and it's going to reload. Okay, good enough. So, and this is filtered for just pedestrians. So you can see that the increase has been quickening over the past 4 or 5 years, since 2016 or so. And I don't think that's going to be news to any of y'all. If we look at some components of these crashes, this is fatal and serious injury crashes in Tennessee, and I filtered this dashboard to show only pedestrians. Now, the year-to-date crashes is a total, so that is not filtered, but the rest of the dashboard is showing only pedestrian-involved crashes. And so you can see by location, it's not very surprising. The urban areas have more pedestrian crash, fatal and serious injury crashes than the more rural areas. So you can see Memphis is at 329, and Davidson County up here at 234. And then the other high counties are, as you would suspect, you have Knox County at 77. Oh, and this is, by the way, just so you know the time range, this is 2019, 2020, and 21 year to date. So this is 2 full years plus the current year data that we're looking at. And Chattanooga at 52, and then the other ones, Montgomery County, where the military base is, Rutherford County, where we've got Middle Tennessee State University, and Madison County down here, where we have Jackson, Tennessee. And let me let this load again. There we go. So here you can see the distribution of crashes across the state. Again, this is just fatal and serious injury crashes, but you can see they're pretty widely distributed in the rural areas. And then, as I was pointing out in the map above, concentrated mainly in the urban areas, almost 50%. I think I looked at it right before the presentation. A little over 48% of the non-motorist crashes occur in Shelby and Davidson counties. As far as when the crashes are occurring, the trend for 2020, the dark line here, looked a lot like previous years, except we saw in the fall that the typical increase we see in the fall was even greater than usual. So you can see this is the trend for most years. 2019 looks like a very typical year. The trend stays flat and then ticks up through the summer and the fall, and then jumps back down in the winter. It remains to be seen how 2021 is going to play out. February was good to us because we had 2 ice storms or 2 snowstorms in February. So there was a spate of bad weather in January and February that kept our overall crash numbers from being higher. And then you can see by time of day and day of week that most pedestrian crashes occur late in the day and late in the week. That hasn't changed a lot in 2020. The pandemic changed these trends a little bit. In 2019, you would have seen a little bit higher uptick in the morning hours between 7 and 9 during rush hour, but the morning rush is almost gone, and a lot of it compared to what it used to be. So the evening hours have really been the focus of these crashes lately, and you can see that Friday and Saturday are the highest days, but there are some pretty big chunks on Tuesday and Wednesday where we've had a lot of pedestrian crashes that were fatal or serious injury crashes. You can see I've filtered over here at the pedestrian involved, so we're looking at a total of 1,162 crashes. Some of the other statistics involved in those crashes, the things that we all are used to seeing, distracted driver is fairly high. When there were 82 of these crashes that involved a distracted driver, there were 117 that involved a senior driver. We've seen that tick up again as folks are getting vaccinated and being able to drive. Senior drivers are becoming more involved in crashes than they were in 2020. You can see that in 54 of the crashes, the driver had been drinking, and in 42, the driver had used drugs. Now there's some overlap there, so it's not 66 or 96 drug and drinking crashes, but somewhere in that area is going to be a pretty big. There's a pretty big involvement of alcohol and drugs on the driver's parts in these crashes. And then one other thing to note is that 48 of these involved a large truck, and we know that the large vehicles on the roadway present visibility problems as far as striking pedestrians, and also the mass of the vehicle leads to worse outcomes when pedestrians are struck by those medium and heavy trucks. I thought one other thing that might be useful to look at here for pedestrians were light conditions. And you can see that the majority, well, not the majority, a plurality of these crashes occurred in dark but lighted areas. So at nighttime or in a dark condition, but where there was lighting. And then next, during the daytime, daylight, when we see most of our crashes that are not involving pedestrians are in the daytime. And then again, in dark, not lighted, 246. So the majority of the crashes did occur in the dark. Some, about 2/3 of those in the dark were in lighted areas, and another third were in areas that were not lighted. You can see, though, that being in a not lighted area led to worse outcomes for the pedestrian. So 40.7% of the fatal crashes that involved the pedestrian occurred in a dark, not lighted area. One other thing on the website I wanted to make you aware of, we have crash maps. We have GIS resources out there for folks, not just for non-motorist crashes, but for all the categories you see here. We're going to take a look at this one right here, non-motorist involved crashes, so we can get another look at how crashes are distributed across the state. So this is what non-motorist involved crashes for 2018 to 2021. And again, you can see in the rural areas, they're fairly evenly distributed and then clumped around the urban areas. If we take a quick look at what kinds of crashes we were having, and let's expand the layer list. Oh, we can't filter on those. I'll zoom in since the GNRC is hosting us. I'll zoom in on Davidson County here in that area around there. So you can see that you have crashes. We know that these were a lot of times where these crashes occurred. So you can see you have pedestrian crashes, and I know the area, so I can show you right here along a state route. That's Knowlesville Road. I believe that's US 4131. You've also got crashes up here along Gallatin Pike inside the city, and then up closer to my house in Madison. There's a lot of retail and close residential stuff up here, and a lot of mid-block bus stops as well in this area. So you see quite a few crashes. Just to zoom in to give you an idea of how you can use this resource. You see a lot of crashes right here between Due West and Old Turkey Boulevard. And if you know this area, you know there's a ton of pedestrian traffic here. There's a lot of residential areas right over here with a lot of commercial areas on the other side of the street. And there's a few mid-block bus stops here that also cause an issue for folks trying to cross in the middle of the block. So that's a way that you can use this map. It's good for looking at clusters in your area. And so you can go through and find different clusters all over the state. And we could spend a long time doing this. It's really actually quite fascinating to look at the different cities and look at where these crashes are happening. Along those lines, I'll show you one other one. One thing that I was talking with one of our law enforcement liaisons a couple of months ago, and in Memphis, you know, the crashes, a lot of the pedestrian crashes occur where you would expect in the city center and the urban core. But we found a really interesting trend down here by the airport. These two roads that run to the north and to the south of the airport had quite a few pedestrian crashes, and rather serious pedestrian crashes going on right here and right here. And those were areas that the law enforcement liaison down there wasn't really aware of. So we were able to locate some interesting clusters of crashes in Memphis that they could help take care of. And one of the things we found out again here, there's some high density residential areas around here with some commercial stuff that the folks in those areas are walking to and from along that roadway. So I thought I would, more than anything, allow you all to see this resource and know that it's out there for you. We update it quarterly. So if you're looking to find clusters of crashes in your area, here's a great resource for you to use. There are a couple of other things that I want to show you that weren't on the dashboard or on the map. I'm going to share a different screen here. Let's there. Where's my backup? So we want to share that one, I believe. Okay, great. So this is a few other things about pedestrian motor vehicle crash trends in Tennessee. So I wanted to look at, first off, demographics. And let me see if I can. Let me share this differently. Get out of presentation mode. Let me just share it this way. All right, so one of the things we can look at with demographics here is, let me, just gonna edit the data, and that way I can change the information that you're looking at on the fly. Okay, so I took a look at a few different demographic categories here. I looked at race and ethnicity, and then also gender and age. I think that for gender, there was not a lot surprising there. If we wait for that to update, you can see that as in all crashes, males are, and these are this is pedestrians who were killed or seriously injured in crashes is what we're looking at. And so you can see that males are about twice as likely to be one of the pedestrians killed or seriously injured than females are. And then if we looking at ethnicity, it's held pretty stable for between, we only collect Hispanic and non-Hispanic ethnicity. So you can see for Hispanic folks, it's been pretty stable, and same for non-Hispanic folks. It basically follows the overall trend. And then this one was interesting to me. When we take a look at race, we can see that for white folks and other non-white folks who are not Black or African American, there's a slight decrease over the past 4 years in being pedestrians involved in motor vehicle crashes. But for Black folks, we saw, especially in 2020, a pretty significant increase there. So that maybe is a category we could focus on. And then one other thing about demographics is looking at age groups over time. You can see that typically it's going to be the age groups right around, let me see if it can hover. Yeah, 25 to 35 are most likely to be involved in these crashes. We think of younger folks being the kids walking back and forth to school, things like that. But typically they are less represented in these crashes. And you find folks between the ages of 25 to 39 that are highly represented and sometimes overrepresented in these crashes. And you can see 2020 had a slightly different distribution, where we had folks between 50 and 60 being highly represented in these crashes, where they were less so in the past. So that's a little demographic information for you. I also looked at the actions and conditions of the pedestrians. We looked on the fatal and serious injury crash dashboard to look at the actions and conditions of the drivers, but the pedestrians themselves, for the most part, appear normal. So you can see 849 pedestrians, and this is from 2016 to 2020, were marked as appeared normal or unknown. Now, unfortunately, that one gets marked a lot on our crash report for actions. And these are conditions for pedestrians. So next in line is had been drinking. And I think after that, it tails off quite a bit. You've got other, and this is physical impairment, things like that. Drug use is less than 50. So in general, we're saying if the pedestrian has done something to contribute to the crash, or they have a condition to contribute to the crash, it's usually that they have been drinking. And you can see over 5 years, it's not a huge amount, 255 out of a little over 1,100. If we take a look, we can look at their actions as well. So let's pull that up and switch over to the actions for these folks. Okay. A second to filter. There's a lot of categories. All right, and here we are by actions. So you can see that the majority, or well, not the majority, but about 25% or so of the pedestrians, a little more than that, were crossing at an unsignalized point. It doesn't say if they were at an intersection or not, but they were crossing with no signal. And then you get darting, running, or stumbling into the road. And typically, I think that's when a pedestrian enters the roadway unexpectedly and is struck. Of course, the good news is that number 3 in the category is actions is none. And then we also have not visible. And I can tell you one of those intersections we were looking at in Davidson County, it's an uphill to that intersection from every direction. And when you're turning left in any direction out of that intersection, it's very easy to turn left and have a pedestrian appear over the horizon. And then for our 5th one, we've got other action. Again, not as helpful, unknown, not as helpful, but walking and cycling beside the roadway, lying or standing or playing in the roadway, and then so on and so forth. There's quite a few of them. And so that's the actions and conditions on the part of the pedestrians that were contributing. And then this one, I don't have anything to filter. I just wanted to show you where the pedestrians typically are when they're being struck. And so you can see that a large number of them, maybe 2/3 or more, were not in an intersection and not in a crosswalk. So they're either crossing mid-block or they're walking. They should have beside the roadway marked, but I'm sure a lot of these are walking beside the roadway. But they're on a roadway at some point where there's not an intersection or a crosswalk. And you can see that the first 3 of these are not at an intersection, and they're either crosswalks not available or they're on the side of the roadway. And it really quickly tails off when you start to get to pedestrians at intersections. I think a lot of this is driven, number one, by mid-block crossing in the urban areas, but also for the pedestrian crashes in the rural areas, a lot of the pedestrian infrastructure is not available. And that covers everything I have to talk about today. There are other trends we could talk about. I could go on for a long time about this, but I thought I would try and focus on the big trends and the big characteristics of these crashes to give the folks here some indication of the problem we face and how to tackle it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for this overview of the pedestrian crash trends in Tennessee and where to find this interactive dashboard so that everyone can go navigate and look at the data. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel for some of the regional statistics and policies. And I can advance the slides for you. Let me pull those up. Let's see.
Thank you. So Ashley's actually going to go first with the trends, and then I'll take over.
Okay, great, thanks.
Awesome, thank you. Here we're showing the crashes by severity by mode, and this is representing crashes from 2015 to 2019 within our MPO region. And basically what you can see from these graphs is that as the crash becomes more severe, pedestrians make up a larger percentage. Specifically at fatalities for those 5 years, they made up 12.9%. And if you go to the next slide. And for those same years, for 2015 to 2019, we're showing the geographic distribution of crashes. We had a total of 3,145 over those 5 years, averaging a little over 600 per year. Next slide. And then looking at 2020's crashes in comparison to those, you can see those in navy blue. We had a total of 451 total pedestrian involved crashes in the year 2020, which was about 28% decrease from our past 5-year average. And as you've heard previously, those locations showed up in similar places like downtown urban centers and places that similarly for the past 5 years. Next slide. Here we're looking at 2015, 2019, and we're looking at severe crashes, so those that resulted in a serious injury or fatality. And in those 5 years, we had a total of 678 severe pedestrian crashes, roughly 136 per year. Let's go to the next slide. The distribution of severe crashes in 2020. Unlike with overall pedestrian crashes, we saw an increase in severe crashes involving pedestrians of about 1.5% above the 5-year average. We had a total of 138 severe crashes in the year 2020. If you go to the next slide. Here we're looking at the trend in all crashes, not just pedestrian crashes. And you can see we had a significant decline in overall crashes of about 23%, a slight decrease in serious injuries of about 3%, and a very slight decrease in fatalities of 1%. But if you go to the next slide, you can see that the bars in this chart are representing pedestrian-involved crashes that resulted in a serious injury, and the line is representing crashes involving motorists. And while we have a significant decrease in overall serious injuries, crashes involving a pedestrian resulting in a serious injury has remained fairly consistent in 2020. And in 2020, there was a 6% decrease from the past 5-year average. If you go to the next slide. Here we can show, as I showed earlier with overall crashes, we had a slight decrease in fatalities of about 1% overall, but what we saw with pedestrians is a 12% increase. And it increased actually fatalities on average about 8% for all fatalities in the region, but about doubled for pedestrian fatalities of about 12%. And if you go to the next slide. We wanted to take a look at highly vulnerable areas, which 17% of our region's population resides in these areas. And we defined highly vulnerable areas where there are 6 or more disadvantaged populations, such as poverty, unemployment, racial minority, ethnic minority, carless households, single mother households, elderly, limited English speaking, and disabled. There are 21 highly vulnerable areas within our MPO region. And if you go to the next slide. This graph really highlights how pedestrians and even bike crashes occur in areas that are highly vulnerable. HVAs account for 6% of the area in the region, but yet over a third of pedestrian crashes occur in these areas, and over 41% of fatalities. Of the factors included within the HVAs, disabled, racial minority, carless, and poverty contain the largest percentage of pedestrian crashes, respectively. And if you go to the next slide. So through all of our analysis, we started pulling out factors pertaining to the roadway network that we wanted to analyze a little bit further. And one of those being, I'm just going to highlight a few. There were a bunch that we actually took a look at, but some of that were noteworthy were travel lanes, for example. So in the gray bar, you can see the percentage of roadway miles within our MPA region that have, that designation 2 lanes, 3 lanes, 4 lanes. And what we saw was there was a significant number of bike and pedestrian crashes on 2-lane roadways, but that was likely due to the fact that there were more 2-lane roads. But what was interesting is that there was a disproportionate higher number of bike ped crashes occurring on 4-lane roadways. And if you go to the next slide. We also took a look at proximity to transit stop, and as you can see again, there was a disproportionate high number of bike ped crashes occurring within 500 feet of roadway of a transit stop. But we also took a look at functional classification. We also looked at bike facilities. We looked at a number of things. We're just highlighting just a couple right now. And if you go to the next slide, we found something very interesting that seems to obviously work, is that the percentage of pedestrian crashes within a school zone is significantly lower. Usually school zones within our region are about 1/4 of a mile, and as soon as you exit that school zone buffer, you usually see this pretty significant increase in pedestrian-related crashes. And if you want to go to the next slide, I think I'm turning it over to Daniel to go over some of the safety programs within our region.
Thank you, Ashley. So you can move on to the next slide. So I'll start by introducing our Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee, or what we call our BPAC. We reconvened our BPAC back in January of 2020 in the midst of our regional transportation plan update. We've met almost monthly since, and it's really turned into a forum for anything active transportation related. We've got planners and elected officials from a few of our local governments, representatives from transit agencies, law enforcement, and advocacy groups for bike ped users and the disability community. A typical meeting usually consists of discussion of regional and local crash analyses, such as the trends that Ashley just discussed, feedback on local, state, and regional bike and pedestrian plans and activities, and we spend a lot of our time collaborating on strategies to address regional active transportation issues. Next slide, please. So we adopted our long-range regional transportation plan back in February of this year, but we spent the last year and a half updating and analyzing bike and pedestrian conditions and trends to understand what the most important issues and needs for people walking and biking in the region were. And to do that, we collaborated with the BPAC on what we called BPAC priority areas, which identified where we should be investing in active transportation improvements. So I'll mention that the BPAC weighed safety as the most important factor, with health disparities, demand, comfort, and congestion also factoring into the priority areas. So the map you see on the right is what we ended up with for pedestrian priority areas. And in addition to evaluating the projects based on these priority areas, staff also evaluated each project submitted to the plan based on the pedestrian accommodations they were providing and the project's ability to address the needs staff in the BPAC identified. Next slide, please. So since we adopted the RTP, we've been able to take a deeper dive into crash data and worked with the data team and Ashley on staff to create a bike and pedestrian safety index. We looked at hotspots and crash trends through the RTP, but we saw that there was a need to do a more systemic analysis looking at pedestrian crash risk factors across the region. The map on the right is the Pedestrian Safety Index, which shows us where people walking and biking are more susceptible to crashes. So not only locations where crashes have occurred in the past, but also locations that share similar characteristics that may be susceptible to crashes going forward. So as part of our RTP, we also have a grant program called the Active Transportation Program, which funds projects and programs that promote safe conditions for walking and biking. And this is funding set aside each RTP cycle, and we hope to have a goal for projects this summer for that program, and also hope to use the safety index to help us prioritize projects for that program. Next slide, please. Finally, I'll highlight some of the great work being done locally in our region. Sumner County, for example, recently received funding through the Urban Transportation Planning Grant Program facilitated by TDOT for a countywide bike and pedestrian master plan. And Metro Nashville is the first city in the state to do a Vision Zero plan, which they kicked off about a month ago. And we hope that plan will set a precedent that pedestrian fatalities are preventable and give us a roadmap for how to move forward with that initiative. WeGo, Nashville's transit agency, released their Better Bus Plan last year, which includes funding for bus stop improvements and the pedestrian infrastructure associated with them. In terms of pedestrian safety policies, Nashville and the city of Hendersonville are two of our local communities who have complete streets policies in place, but we know that's something our region needs to work on to encourage the majority of our communities to adopt complete streets policies. In terms of dedicated funding and local investment in pedestrian safety, for example, WeGo analyzed pedestrian crashes in relation to their bus stops across Nashville and is investing in bus stop improvements to their plan to make it safer for pedestrians to access transit, which we saw was a huge issue from our research across the region. And this has turned into individual projects such as the Nolensville Shelter Project, a location our index also identified as dangerous. And our region has a need for more dedicated funding, especially to pedestrian safety, and that's why we're excited for this workshop so we can start implementing some of these countermeasures and other solutions to improve pedestrian safety across the region. And that's all we've got from the regional perspective, and I'll hand it back to Luba to continue the presentation.
Thank you, Ashley and Daniel. I appreciate this review of the local trends and data. It certainly sounds like you guys are ahead of the curve in terms of doing a lot of this detailed local data analysis already at the regional level, some of the systemic analysis. So kudos to you all for undertaking this process. So with that, we're going to jump into the step materials to talk about pedestrian safety and so the process, some of the steps involved that we would recommend when you're reviewing unsignalized intersections or unsignalized crossing locations. But if you think of comments that come up, maybe if you're thinking of specific locations that might or might not overlap with some of those hotspots already highlighted on the maps that you've seen, if you just get a thought that comes to mind, like, hey, why don't we try to improve an intersection here or crossing right here, feel free to add that to the chat, and we'll kind of use that for a couple of discussion points as we go through the presentation. All right, so today, again, let's review some of the steps involved when you're trying to improve pedestrian safety at unsignalized intersection. And first, we're going to introduce the step innovation. Generally, STEP is focused on enhancing crossing safety. Safe transportation for every pedestrian is the STEP acronym. And so as you can see from those icons on the slide, a lot of the 7 countermeasures that we'll be talking about today that are under the STEP umbrella, they're generally very beneficial at mid-block crossing locations or unsignalized crossing locations. But some of those features also play really well in combination with signalized or intersection crossing improvements. So, for example, high visibility crosswalk markings could be a great partner to implement in tandem with a signalized or unsignalized crossing location. And then one of the features we'll be talking about today, LPIs, relating pedestrian intervals, those are also great at signalized intersection locations. So we are not necessarily focusing today on improving pedestrian safety for pedestrians walking alongside of the road. Those are some of the kind of frequent crash types that might be occurring outside of urban areas where you don't have sidewalks. Sometimes you'll see that in the crash data and statistics that a pedestrian got hit while walking alongside the road, especially in dark conditions. It is a concern, but for today, with this focus on more urban type pedestrian crashes, we're more interested in how do we address those unsignalized pedestrian crossings and how to make existing signalized pedestrian crossings safer. So why are we talking about this issue, and why is it such a big concern to improve pedestrian safety at unsignalized crossing locations? So if you think about kind of the arc of how the US has been developing since the 1950s, as people started to shift their living location more to the suburbs, we have seen this trend in development where a lot of the roadways have gotten wider. We have this variety of multi-lane arterials. And this is typically where we see a lot of our commercial destinations that are located along those multi-lane arterials. You might have your grocery stores, restaurants, other retail destinations. And this is also where your bus stops are going to be located along those major urban multi-lane arterials. So on one hand, great, there's a variety of destinations, a variety of uses. On the other hand, in terms of keeping the traffic flow going, it makes sense to space the signalized intersections pretty far apart. So they could be quarter mile, even further apart between signalized intersections. So what do we do to help get pedestrians across those corridors safely? For example, here you see this bus stop at a mid-block location. How does a pedestrian get to the bus stop from the other side of the road? Sometimes there's not really a logical solution implemented as part of adding those bus stops, for example, but anytime we have a commercial corridor like this where you have a variety of uses, you have this potential for pedestrian trips being generated, especially if transit service is also present on the corridor. As planners and engineers, we have to consider what does it mean for pedestrian trips and pedestrian activity? How are people going to get to those destinations? How are they going to get to the bus stop? And can we help them get there safely? So this is where some of the countermeasures come in that we'll be talking about today. So to review a little bit of what makes up a crosswalk, of course, crosswalk is one of those basic building blocks to help improve the safety of a crossing location. Crosswalk markings can provide guidance both for pedestrians and drivers. So for pedestrians, they help define and delineate the appropriate walking path on approach to and within signalized intersection and approach to other intersections where traffic stops. You can also use crosswalk markings in conjunction with signs and other measures to alert road users of a designated pedestrian crossing point across roadways at locations that are not controlled by traffic signals or by stop or yield signs. And then at non-intersection locations, the crosswalk marking is what actually legally establishes a crosswalk. So for example, if you do have a mid-block crossing location with two bus stops, one on each side, in the absence of marked crosswalk, you would say, well, there's no crosswalk there, but marking the crosswalk would make it legally a crosswalk. At intersection locations, if there are sidewalks on approach, you don't have to have the crosswalk markings to have a legal crosswalk there already established just by virtue of sidewalks coming together at an intersection. So when thinking about where it would make sense to mark a crosswalk, thinking about pedestrian trip generators, some of those activity centers and nodes, it really helps to identify what are the appropriate pedestrian paths and locations to mark a crosswalk. So in this example on the slide, we see an apartment complex on one side, a grocery store on the other side, bus stops. So it seems like a pretty logical spot, right? If you have people trying to get from the apartments to the grocery store, or maybe get to the bus stop, anytime a person is going to ride the bus, they have to cross the road, either on one leg of their trip or on the return leg. So that kind of helps to think through and identify potential crossing locations that would make sense to stripe a crosswalk. And then we also have to think about human nature. Just because there is a signalized intersection with a marked crosswalk nearby, it doesn't always mean that the pedestrian is going to use that signalized intersection location. A lot of times human psychology is such that we prefer to see a clear line, a clear path for walking trips, and also to try and take a shorter trip, right? It could take an extra 5-10 minutes for a pedestrian to walk out of their way to get to the signalized intersection. At the signalized intersection, they might also be facing other conflicts and threats potentially from drivers taking a left turn or a right turn. So sometimes there's this perception that you're going to walk further out of your way to get to the signalized intersection, signalized crossing, and you might still not be very much safer as a result. So generally, if a pedestrian sees a clear line of sight and looks like there's not too many cars, so they might spot a good break in traffic, a lot of people will tend to go ahead and take the risk and cross, even if there's not a signed crosswalk. and in reviewing some of the data earlier, some of the earlier speakers, you've seen that there is this preponderance towards males being involved in injury crashes, pedestrian crashes. So I would also think that that's probably more likely to be associated with younger male behavior. They're more likely to take that risk and walk across a roadway, even if there's not a signed crosswalk there. So again, just human nature, not just guys, right? Women do too, but sometimes when we see a clear path, clear line of sight, that's where the human mind gravitates towards trying to cross there. When we think about the added time and distance added when a person is forced to walk out of their way to get to a signalized crossing, it can really add up. So in this illustration, you see somebody who would have to walk to an intersection location and then come back for their ultimate trip destination. That would add about 850 feet. Versus if they had a mid-block crossing of opportunity, that could be about 250 feet. So that's a difference of 3 minutes of walking time. Now, 3 minutes might not seem significant, but if you think about somebody who's already a pretty busy person, if they're trying to navigate working a job, taking the transit, maybe picking up their child from daycare or school, stopping at a grocery store, although those things could be more complicated if somebody's also taking transit and doesn't have access to a personal vehicle, and then you tell them that they have to walk an extra 3 minutes out of their way, maybe with heavy grocery bags or holding a child's hand, that can all add up and be quite significant. And also, if you think about, a typical arterial that's signed for 50, 55 mile per hour, in terms of the driver perspective, if you told them that they have to travel an extra 3 minutes, well, that could be an almost 3 miles down the road. So if you imagine an urban arterial, would you force drivers to travel 3 miles down the road? Even in interstate conditions, usually there's interstate exits in urban areas that are spaced closer than 3 miles. So again, just in terms of like comparing driver expectations and pedestrian expectations, we do not typically force drivers to travel 3 miles out of their way to get to the nearest location where they can get off, do a U-turn or turn. And so for pedestrians to travel 3 minutes out of their way can be quite a significant hassle. So especially when you have a mid-block location that can be a safer crossing location versus a conflicted intersection with a lot of conflicting movements. In some cases, intersections can again also present their own safety challenges. So this slide illustrates some of the conflicts and threats that a pedestrian has to evaluate when navigating a mid-block crossing. So in this case, we're dealing with a 5-lane arterial with 2-way left turn lane. For a pedestrian, it's a challenge to have to pay attention in both directions, right? So they have to look to the left, look to the right, and find a break in traffic that would accommodate their trip with a break in traffic in both directions. So there is that mental challenge of trying to navigate conflicts from both directions. But if you think about a pedestrian trying to cross at an intersection, again, there's going to be some of the conflicts. And so a pedestrian has to pay attention to cars that might be turning right in front of their path. They might not see them right away. They also have to pay attention to vehicles turning left in front of their path and not seeing them immediately. So some of those can also be a challenge, even though there might be a pedestrian signal phase, pedestrian crossing markings. So going back to 2005, there was some research published that looked at the effects of marked versus unmarked crosswalks at uncontrolled locations. So they primarily looked at, they looked at both 2-lane and multi-lane roadways. And they also looked at the differences by speed as well as the number of lanes and median versus no median. So for 2-lane roads, in this case, there was no significant difference in crash rate at marked versus unmarked crosswalk locations on 2-lane roadways. On multi-lane roadways with 3 or more lanes, there was a difference based on traffic volumes and presence of median. So looking at multi-lane roadways under 12,000 vehicles per day, there was no significant difference in crash rate between marked versus unmarked crosswalk locations. Over 12,000 vehicles per day without median, crashes at marked crosswalk locations exceeded crashes at unmarked crosswalk locations. And then over 15,000 vehicles per day with medians, crashes at marked locations also exceeded crashes at unmarked crosswalk locations. So this research might have been misinterpreted in some situations to suggest that marking crosswalks is not recommended on multi-lane roads. In effect, what this research is suggesting to us is that we need to consider additional safety measures to reinforce those locations where simply marking a crosswalk alone across multi-lane arterial is not enough. And there's also this one underlying factor that might be involved in this increased crash rate, and that has to do with the multiple threat crashes. So what happens is if there is a marked crosswalk, the driver in the right lane might do what they're supposed to and actually stop for the pedestrian crosswalk, but the driver approaching in the next lane might not be able to see the pedestrian behind the stopped vehicle, and they might not realize that the vehicle in the right lane is actually stopped for the pedestrian crosswalk. They're likely to proceed, and then they would be nearing the crosswalk right around the same time as the pedestrian is getting to the point in their crossing. And so this multiple threat crash situation does occur. There are ways to remedy it with advanced stop line or advanced yield markings, and we'll talk about it some more in the future. Here's another illustration of a multiple threat crash problem. Again, car A stops for pedestrian crosswalk like they're supposed to. At the same time, car A is obscuring the line of sight for the driver in car B. So as car B approaches, they might not know why car A stopped. They might not observe the fact that there is a assigned crosswalk and they're proceeding, and they're getting ready to cross the crosswalk location right at the same time as the pedestrian is entering that area of conflict. Rochelle has talked a little bit about the travel speeds earlier and the effect on the survival statistics. So in addition to having an impact on how likely pedestrians are to survive in crashes, the travel speed also makes a huge difference for stopping sight distance, right? So if a driver is traveling faster, they're going to need to have a lot more distance to have the full length to be able to react to seeing a pedestrian or seeing the crosswalk markings, start applying the brakes, and actually come to a reasonably complete stop. So when you're talking about 20 miles per hour, it might take them 100 feet to fully react to a crosswalk or a pedestrian in the crosswalk and come to a full stop. And if you're talking about 40 miles per hour, you're looking at almost 350 feet for the full reaction braking distance. So this longer distance means that we need a lot more additional supports on multi-lane high-speed arterials where drivers are likely to be traveling at higher speeds. So we need to give them a lot more warning so the drivers actually know that something's coming up and they can react in time. Otherwise, it's just not enough distance. If they just see the warning sign right in front of the crosswalk and it doesn't give them enough notice to actually start reacting 350 feet up the road. So the manual on uniform traffic control devices does have some guidance on signing versus non-signing crosswalks. There's not a warrant required to add marked crosswalks. However, there's some guidance that suggests that in some situations, a marked crosswalk alone is probably not sufficient. So the specific language indicates that marked crosswalks alone without other measures designed to reduce traffic speeds, shorten crossing distances, enhance driver awareness of the crossing, and or provide active warning of pedestrian presence should not be installed across uncontrolled roadways where the speed limit exceeds 40 miles per hour and or either those roadways have 4 or more lanes without a raised median or island and ADT of 12,000 vehicles per day or more, or 4 or more lanes with a raised median island and ADT of 15,000 vehicles or more. So that kind of reflects back on that study from 2005 that we have also referenced. And again, this guidance from the METCD does not suggest that it's not important to mark a crosswalk, but it does suggest that in some locations and situations, additional safety measures are needed. And so as part of the STEP workshop, we'll be reviewing those 7 countermeasures that provide additional potential elements to help enhance the conspicuity of those crosswalks, make them more visible to the drivers, make it so the drivers have more opportunity to see them in advance and react and come to a complete stop. So there's still some crosswalk myths circulating around there. And one is that there is an METCD pedestrian volume warrant for marked crosswalks. In reality, the METCD does not have a warrant requirement for marking pedestrian crosswalks. Another myth is that research supports the removal of crosswalks. In reality, removal of marked crosswalks is not a great solution. Generally, if there's a marked crosswalk and you think it's not safe enough, there should be a consideration for how to improve the safety of the crossing location, or what's the alternative. You can't just remove a crosswalk without finding a good alternative safe crossing location or additional measures that could be taken. And another myth that remains out there a little bit is that not marking a crosswalk is actually safer than marking a crosswalk. But the reality, again, is that pedestrians are going to try and cross in a variety of different locations with or without marked crosswalks. So simply by not signing the crosswalk, you're not necessarily making the situation safer for them. Rather, the research demonstrates that marked crosswalks alone along high-speed or high-volume roadways are not sufficient to improve pedestrian safety, and so we need to do more, or rather than give up and say, oh, I'm not striping a crosswalk, it's too dangerous here. So today, the bulk of our presentation is going to focus on the guide for improving pedestrian safety at uncontrolled crossing locations. So in some ways, this guide updates the guidance that was the result of the 2005 study that I already mentioned. So this guide for improving pedestrian safety at uncontrolled crossing locations, you can find it from the Federal Highway Safety website. And we recommend that you go and find this guide, look at it. And if you don't need to download the whole guide, I would suggest you at least look at downloading Table 1 and Table 2 from the guide. Those can be very handy guidance documents. And I think Table 1 is what Peter had on his t-shirt, right? Here we go. If you have one takeaway from the workshop today, go download Table 1 and have that as a handy reference guide for your future projects, because it can always be a good starting point of discussion. It does not prescribe a specific measure for every given situation or location, but it suggests what are some of the starting considerations, and it still gives you the flexibility for that engineering judgment, your local knowledge to figure out what are some of the best solutions to implement from this menu of options. So Table 1, go and find it. So in addition to this lovely Table 1 with countermeasures, the guide also walks you through the process of selecting the best countermeasures. And so similar to many planning processes, you would start by collecting the data. So next we're going to review some of those steps involved in identifying and selecting your most appropriate countermeasure for a given situation. So step 1, again, collect the data, engage the public. Of course, you want to look at your pedestrian crash and safety, and it sounds like the MPO has already done a lot of that work for your region. And also you have some great, the dashboard interactive tool that's available for the state of Tennessee. So it sounds like if you are with a local municipality in this region, you already have access to some of those great tools and resources. And if you need to go look at your crash statistics, you can go and find the data. You would also want to look at evaluating your pedestrian accommodation policies, what's happening with some of those locally adopted plans, zoning regulations. You could consider initiating a pedestrian safety action plan. Those could be done at a regional municipal level. You probably want to review your pedestrian traffic safety plans. And then as an optional tool, you could also conduct a walkability audit where you bring a group of professionals out in the field, and preferably in interdisciplinary teams, so people have a variety of perspectives represented and people can actually walk the corridor, look at the location on the ground. Sometimes you can really see in real life some of those features and details that are less obvious from maybe a Google Street View review. Maybe there's a particular bush that's obstructing visibility for drivers. Maybe there's a lighting issue or something else going on that might be a little bit harder to read from just looking at the location and aerial views. So at a higher level, it helps to consider the overall network and not just a particular potential crossing location or your crash site, but what else is happening nearby, right? So this slide kind of illustrates some of the activity generators, some of the locations you might want to consider, how the network kind of fits together for pedestrian trips. So is there maybe a trail connection nearby? Are there schools, daycare centers? Is there a bus stop, a grocery store? And then you can also look at your crash history, look at maybe where the public has been reporting some of their safety concerns. Is there neighborhood connection, maybe an apartment complex nearby? So looking at this kind of bigger picture view of what else is happening in the general area, that's really, really helpful. And that's where some of the feedback from the public can also be helpful, because a local community group might be more aware of why certain trip patterns are happening, right? Maybe there's a food pantry that's particularly busy on Wednesday afternoons only, or maybe there's a school, maybe after school club that meets on Tuesdays and Thursdays 2 to 4, and after 4 p.m. you kind of see this group of kids that's trying to cross at this location, right? So talking to your local and neighborhood group sometimes is also helpful to to get a little bit more of that feedback on what is happening with this pedestrian behavior and why are people trying to, cross at this location in particular. Your step number 2 in your approach to selecting a step countermeasure would be inventory conditions and prioritize your locations. So you would take a look at your existing pedestrian crossing locations. Ideally, you already would have some starting data in GIS. Some locations do have that data available. Some locations might not. That could be a great opportunity for a summer intern to collect some additional data if you feel like that's a big need and you don't already have an existing resource. You would also want to classify your pedestrian crossings. Controlled versus uncontrolled crossing locations are important to document. You'd want to inventory your roadway characteristics. As already mentioned, the speed, the number of lanes, the traffic volumes are going to make a difference for what type of pedestrian crossing countermeasures are appropriate. So if you have those roadway characteristics already documented, a lot of times your state DOT is going to be collecting the data and providing that in GIS format. But if that data is already not available, maybe it's a local road or a locally maintained road where the DOT does not have the data. Again, you want to make sure that you have access to the appropriate roadway characteristics data to help inform your decision for selecting that appropriate countermeasure. And then you can also conduct a system-wide analysis to look and see where are the particular gaps in between some of those safe crossing locations. So there are a lot of benefits to having a good inventory of your baseline conditions. It kind of helps you track progress over time, just general asset management to identify where maybe some of the crosswalks have been striped a few years ago and now they need a little bit of attention, maybe some restriping and repair, maybe if you already had some sort of beacon or rapid rectangular flashing beacon, maybe there's some maintenance issue with the lights not flashing correctly. So having a good inventory provides you with that baseline analysis, and you can keep track of it over time better. This slide illustrates an inventory example from Los Angeles, where they went through and collected their uncontrolled crosswalk inventory. So you can see they included the primary street, the cross street. They added an ID for each location, and then they included some of the parameters such as whether there's striping, channelization, and median island. And then they added some of the additional factors in here. If you don't already have a local inventory or regional or statewide inventory that could be applicable to your location, and if you're trying to collect data from scratch, then the STEP field guide could be a helpful resource where it provides some specific questions you'd want to ask and address as part of collecting your data. So it asks questions, for example, about the land use context, location, nearby destinations. There's some of the roadway features, such as speed and volume, crosswalk features, whether or not there's marking signs, beacons, and signals included. It asks you questions about crash history, whether there's any planned roadway upgrades or projects nearby, and then sidewalks and curb ramps, right? A lot of times, if the roadway hasn't been updated in the last 20 years, you'll probably find that even if they are curb ramps, they're not up to modern day ADA standards. So if you are collecting the inventory, the collecting data about your ADA features could also be helpful. That could help you with your local ADA transition plans in the future if you're trying to update your ADA transition plan. So as part of the data analysis, you could look at your high crash locations by a specific location, intersection possibly, or by corridor. And then you could also look at systemic approach with identifying roadway context features associated with higher pedestrian crash risk. And it sounds like in the Nashville and PR region, you already have an example of this more systemic approach of pedestrian crash data analysis. So that's a great local example to already have right here. We have some specific local factors that have been linked to higher prevalence of pedestrian crashes. Once you have your data analyzed or compiled in a good place, you can look at prioritizing your spot locations based on crashes. And this map illustrates just a little bit of a heat map that helps us to identify some of the concentrations, those priority areas based on the concentration of fatality and severe injury crashes. So here, red dots are fatalities and orange dots are severe injury pedestrian crashes, for example, from Richmond, Virginia. And you can see how certain locations and corridors tend to pop up once you do this heat mapping of pedestrian crashes. So we'll talk a little bit more about the systemic approach to safety. It sounds like, again, this is something that's already occurred in this region. So again, kudos to the local team. And there is a great guidance document out there in CHRP 8923. So if you wanted to do more systemic pedestrian safety analysis, again, that's a good guidance document that you can download from online. But systemic improvement is generally an improvement that is widely implemented based on a high-risk roadway feature, high-risk roadway features that are correlated with particular crash types rather than with crash frequency. Systemic approach is more proactive, risk-based, data-driven, and it's a process. So similar to the step countermeasure selection process that we've been talking about, the systemic approach to safety has its own series of 7 steps, which is somewhat similar, but a little bit different to selecting the countermeasure. But again, you would start with defining the study scope. Are you looking at the whole region? Are you just looking at a county, a city? Are you looking at a particular corridor? You would compile your baseline data. You would look at determining the risk factors. A lot of times that actually involves statistical analysis. So if you haven't done this type of data analysis in the past, it might be helpful to recruit some researchers who are experienced with statistical analysis, maybe partner with your local university. The next step would be identify potential treatment sites, select potential countermeasures, and then refine and implement treatment plan and evaluate project. So one of the things that systemic approach allows you to do is to crunch through a good amount of data and then come up with the highest priority locations to address. And the reason why prioritization is so important for us is because, as you've already heard from some of the local presenters, there's never quite enough funding, it seems, in the transportation world to address all of the safety concern areas. So we always have to be a little bit more strategic about what are really the worst concern areas and where can we invest our limited public dollars more wisely to really address the worst of the worst situations here. So again, systemic approach to safety is one of those ways in which you can analyze the data, look at specific risk factors that are more appropriate to local context, and that would help you identify and prioritize those particular hotspot areas that are important to address and that can be addressed with some of the types of countermeasures. Some additional review of the systemic safety planning process. And again, it's kind of the step-by-step approach where you look at your local data, including crash types and risk factors. And so part of this process is realizing that implementing a safety improvement might not address all of the different types of crashes, right? If you have a high frequency crash location that's close to a college campus, for example, but you see that there's a spike that occurs, on Friday between midnight and 2 a.m. and maybe is linked to alcohol presence, right? So improving pedestrian safety through countermeasures could help. Some of the crashes might not always address all different types of crashes that you're observing. So it's important to also identify what are the types of crashes, specific situations you are trying and able to address. So going back to our step process in selecting an appropriate pedestrian safety countermeasure, our step number 3 would be analyze crash types and safety issues in more detail. And this is where safety diagrams can be really helpful. So a lot of times if you're looking at GIS data of your pedestrian crashes, you might see kind of this line of dots along a road, but those can actually be a little bit misleading sometimes. When you start looking into the details, you might find that some of them were geocoded to the wrong location. They actually occurred on a different street a couple blocks over, and there was a mistake with geocoding. Some of them might have actually occurred in a parking lot location along that roadway, and so a crossing improvement is not necessarily going to help you address those crashes in parking lots. And then doing the diagrams can also help you identify what are specific patterns and trends that are happening with those specific crashes. Was it a mid-block crossing situation? Was it a crossing happening at a signalized intersection where a pedestrian technically had the right-of-way, but the driver was not yielding? So again, doing more detailed analysis, possibly adding those pedestrian crash diagrams can help to kind of drill down, identify what are the specific situations and factors and behavior they're trying to help improve those situations with safety countermeasures. And again, having an informal site visit can be very helpful to look at some of those local factors such as vegetation and lighting that you might not be able to identify just from a Google aerial. Or you could also formalize and conduct a road safety audit, where it would also be helpful to bring an interdisciplinary team together You get people together, have them review the data first, and then go out in the field and look at it together in the field. And it's helpful for a roadway safety audit to have, for example, representatives from the fire and police, the local emergency responders, in addition to typical DOT, local government representatives. Maybe sometimes the school board would want to be involved, or some of the other local community organizations might be interested. With the roadway safety assessment, there's some additional guidance also available from Federal Highways that can identify some of the typical steps. And so you would start with formulating your RSA team, but also identifying who's actually the project owner, right? Is the local municipality the agency driving this roadway safety audit? Is it the MPO? Is it the DOT? Or who is in charge, basically? And then who's involved in this team? You identify specific projects that you're looking at. Set up a starting meeting, and then perform the field review, analyze report and findings, present those findings to the project owner, prepare formal response, and incorporate findings. So I think one of the advantages of doing a formal RSA is, even as a formal process, it still can be a relatively quick process that can be done over the course of 2 to 3 months. And so you have as an end product this kind of concise document that indicates some of the safety issues, and those recommendations for safety issues that need to be addressed can be easily folded into your future planning processes. For example, if the MPO is updating the long-range plan, or the municipality is updating its comprehensive plan or bicycle and pedestrian plan, you can look at the RSA findings and try to incorporate those RSA findings to actually help prioritize some of the projects in those regional and local plans. So again, RSAs can be done relatively quickly, can be a helpful additional part of the process to identify your needed countermeasures for a particular location. And then in step 4 is where we get to the handy dandy chart 1 from the step guide. And so this table number 1 helps you identify some of the starting thinking again for what specific countermeasures would be appropriate based on the location. So for example, if you have an urban roadway that has 35 miles per hour, say 12,000 vehicles per day, and it's a 4-lane plus roadway without raised median, so 5-lane, 2-way left turn lane in the middle. That means you would come down to, so the row is 4+ lanes without raised median, and then across the top you find your 12,000 vehicles per day, 35 miles per hour, so we're in this yellow column. And then you look at those countermeasures, I think. Okay, so this table number 2 is also kind of a helper that helps you think through what are some of the specific safety issues and behaviors you're trying to address, right? So is this a location that has particular issues with nighttime crashes because there's worse visibility? Is there excessive vehicle speed? Is there inadequate visibility of the crosswalk? So you can kind of look at your safety issues across the top, and then pedestrian crash countermeasures that address those specific safety conditions can be seen across kind of row headings. And so you kind of try to find some of those countermeasures that would be appropriate. I'm just going to go back to table 1 for a second. So again, looking at our 35 miles per hour arterial, 5-lane, no median. The numbers in circles indicate what are some of the countermeasures that needs to be considered. So 1 is in circle, a white circle generally means that it should be considered in combination with other features or countermeasures. And then the black circles indicate that those features should always be considered but are not required. Again, this guide leaves it up to engineering judgment or local context knowledge to identify what are the most appropriate countermeasures. But so again, in the white circle, we see a high visibility crosswalk with markings, parking restrictions, adequate nighttime lighting levels, crossing warning signs. It's kind of a basic feature that can be added to a combination of other safety countermeasures. And then in black circles, we see that advanced yield here to pedestrian sign, pedestrian refuge island, and a pedestrian hybrid beacon should probably be considered as a starting scenario. And then depending on your local context, it might or might not be appropriate. But so again, if you do nothing else after the workshop this week, I would recommend that you go and find your table 1 and table 2 from the step guide, and that can be a great handy dandy reference for you. All right, so moving on. Once you've selected your countermeasure, there's a variety of design guidance to help you actually design this particular treatment. So the METCD, of course, is in the process of being updated, and there might be some small changes, for example, related to pedestrian hybrid beacons. But right now, the METCD is what it is. I believe the latest version is from 2009, so it has parts to deal with signage, markings, highway traffic signals. You also have the AASHTO guide for the design of pedestrian facilities. And then there's a variety of other guidance documents such as PedSafe, Guide for Improving Pedestrian Safety at Uncontrolled Crossing Locations, which is what we're reviewing through the training today, and some of the additional guidance. Out of those guidance materials, the METCD can be downloaded for free. The AASHTO guide does require a fee to download and use, but hopefully if you have a group of professionals who are going to be using it in your office, ideally it makes sense to have at least one version for the group to share. I think with electronic resources is getting tricky too. You kind of have to have a different license for each user. But there's a view of some of those additional guidance materials that are available from the agencies such as Federal Highways, NHTSA, AASHTO, IT, PBIC, Pedestrian Bicycle Information Center. So for example, there's a pedestrian safety guide for transit agencies. As we've already talked about today, there does seem to be this link between bus stop locations on multi-lane arterials and prevalence of pedestrian crashes. Tends to be one of those safety issues. And then the METCD, again, is the document that's in the process of being updated, but currently we have the older version that's still out there. Sometimes local agencies will adopt their own design guidance, and Maryland Context Design Guide is one of those examples. So they've done some really nice illustrations. For example, in this graphic, you can see that they've shown you an example of a buffered bicycle lane, a mid-block crossing with high visibility crosswalk markings, a hog beacon or PHB, and then they're illustrating the high visibility crosswalk striping, what they're calling continental crosswalk striping. And I think Rochelle already shared with you that there is some design guidance from Tennessee DOT, so it's probably a good opportunity to look at your local resources as well if you are considering some of those features. All right, so you figured out your appropriate countermeasure. You feel like you know how to design it. The next step always is to try and monitor the before and after, especially if this is an innovative feature and maybe you haven't tried implementing that countermeasure before. Having the before and after data can be really helpful to help you track performance. How well did it do? Was there an improvement in driver behavior or pedestrian behavior? And they can really serve as good ammunition for the next time when you're considering a similar countermeasure to say, hey, we really tried this at one location. We saw this improvement in pedestrian driver behavior, reduction in crashes. I think it's a good investment of taxpayer dollars. So again, having that before and after data is really helpful to evaluate how well that treatment served for that particular location. That maybe makes it easier to implement a similar countermeasure in other locations in your area as well. As part of the funding, I think one of the items on the slide, it also talks about some of the funding opportunities. And I think you all have already heard a little bit today about the TAP grants, the application through the NPO or through Tennessee DOT. There's also HSIP, safety-specific funding. Typically, the DOT controls the HSIP funding application process, but the NPOs and local governments can provide some feedback regarding what are some of the high priority locations to consider for safety improvements. And then, of course, routine maintenance activities could also be an opportunity to implement some of those safety countermeasures. If restriping a crosswalk could be accomplished as part of routine maintenance, and they can really add to the visibility of a crosswalk. This slide just illustrates some of the features you might want to track if you are doing the before and after evaluation, collecting some of the data. So for example, vehicle compliance in this case was compared, and with a pedestrian hybrid beacon, vehicle compliance or driver compliance has increased to 74% versus it was 27% before. And then pedestrians using the crosswalk, the figure improved from 45% to 49%, which also suggests that pedestrians felt more comfortable using that particular crosswalk location. All right, so that brings us to the next section where we're going to be talking about those specific 7 countermeasures, the spectacular 7 as they're sometimes referred to. I want to take a break and see if there's any maybe comments or questions that have emerged. Does anybody have a burning question or a comment you'd like to share based on everything you've heard so far? Any locations that jump out to you and say, hey, do something here, do something here. This is really a hot spot. Feel free to add a chat box comment or speak up if you have any particular thoughts you'd like to put out to the group at this point before we jump into the next section.
Luba, there was a question about the MUTCD update, helping for simplify the crosswalk application. I'm not sure if you saw that or not.
Yeah, the MUTCD is kind of a moving target right now. Peter, I'm not sure if you'd care to add a comment about the MUTCD changes. It's just so much there.
Yeah, and since it is under the notice of proposed amendments right now, we can't say too much, but I think the question was really more, and I needed some clarification on exactly the crosswalk applications. I think sound like they're wanting to simplify it. So I needed a little more detail. I don't know, Ross, if you want to maybe just quickly describe a little more of what you're trying to say or ask, because right now it is engineering judgment as far as the crosswalk placement. Whether you put in a crosswalk or not. So maybe you can give us a little clarification on the question. Ross, you might be muted. Well, we might be able to take the question during a break or something. You might have stepped away. So. But we've been having some conversations in the chat pod, so I think unless there's some other clarification that needs to be, oh sure, just seemed, in my experience, the ambiguity to crosswalk markings is complex. Well, I guess there is an opportunity, for public comment right now as far as those ambiguities. If you want to make comments to the MUTCD, you can go to the website and find links to where you can do the public comment. But maybe we can help with. I think in this particular workshop, what we're trying to do is, it was stated as far as where you might consider more crosswalk placements, and then in some conditions you may need to do more than just a marked crosswalk. So hopefully, as we go through the rest of this workshop, maybe it'll become less complex, and maybe we can come back to this question later.
Yeah, and tomorrow also, as we are reviewing the local case studies, that might also help to clarify some of those questions. Peter, if you have that link handy for where people can provide comments regarding the draft MUTCD changes, maybe if you could add that into the chat box so that everybody has the opportunity. Thank you.
Will do. Thanks.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and move on. So thanks for the discussion and feedback. So we'll start with our high visibility crosswalk markings. And that's one of the spectacular 7 countermeasures that really plays well with other countermeasures as well. It can also be applicable at signalized crossings as well as mid-block crossing locations. And so this applies to crosswalk marking styles. So as you've already seen from Maryland Context Guide, using those continental style crosswalk markings across the crosswalk, not just along the path of pedestrians. This also applies to including pedestrian warning signs on approach and at the crosswalk to enhance the conspicuity, the visibility of crosswalk. Again, thinking back to how much reaction stopping side distance drivers really need at some of those higher speeds, right? If a driver needs 350 feet to be able to react and come to a complete stop, sometimes you just need to see more of those signs warning them on approach to a crosswalk that something's coming up, pay attention, slow down, so you have time to go ahead and stop at a pedestrian crosswalk. Part of making those crosswalk visibility enhancements is also adding advanced stop or yield lines with signs that would indicate, for example, yield here to pedestrians in crosswalk. And that helps address that multiple threat crash situation that we already talked about, where one driver is stopping and obscuring the visibility for the next driver. This additional visibility features would also include in-street pedestrian crossing signs. They're usually installed in the median refuge island if there's a little island, or just on top of the double yellow line. And that again helps to alert the driver something else is going on. It's hard to ignore the sign that's right in the middle of the road. Curb extensions and parking restrictions on crosswalk approach can also help improve visibility for the drivers and help make it more comfortable for the pedestrian trying to cross. And then also lighting, especially nighttime, dark conditions. It's really important to have good pedestrian scale lighting on approach to the crosswalk. So all of those elements in combination can provide that high visibility crosswalk. This graphic illustrates some of those elements we've already talked about. So again, you have the continental style crosswalk markings across the crosswalk. You have the pedestrian crosswalk warning sign right here with an arrow pointing to where the crosswalk is. You have the pedestrian scale lighting, one on each side. So not directly over top of the crosswalk, but rather to the side. You have this area that's protected from parking on both approaches to make sure the drivers are not parked and obscuring the crosswalk from the driver. And then down below in the smaller graphic, you'll also see an example where there is the curb bulb out situation that also helps to shorten the pedestrian crossing path and makes the crosswalk even more visible to the driver. This slide illustrates a little bit more of how much of a difference using the continental crosswalk markings can really make. So when you include just the two white lines along the pedestrian path, those really can wash out for a driver approaching from a longer distance, or maybe if it's a rainy day or darker conditions, those can be almost impossible to see for the driver approaching the crosswalk. On the other hand, if you add those continental striping type, or possibly piano styles in this case, so they're a little bit offset, those are a lot more visible for the pedestrian approach, or for the driver approaching the crosswalk. In this case, you also see this additional warning signs indicating that it's a school crossing ahead. Pedestrian warning signs used to be this yellow color, and more recently fluorescent green has been recommended for more visibility. Those pedestrian warning signs may be used to alert road users in advance of locations where unexpected entries into the roadway might occur, or where shared use of the roadway by pedestrians, animals, or equestrians might occur. So again, this is dealing with a situation where the drivers really need a little bit more advanced notice, right? Just having this warning sign at the crosswalk location itself is not quite sufficient based on higher speeds, or maybe they're going around the curve, something else is obscuring their line of sight of the crosswalk. So in that case, you can add this advanced warning sign before the driver gets to the crosswalk, and you'd want to add this flag that says ahead. Advanced yield markings are, again, one of those features that can help support the safety of a crosswalk by reducing the multiple threat crash likelihood. And advanced or stop here versus yield here for pedestrians and crosswalks, that's kind of different state by state. In Tennessee, I believe you're in a yield to pedestrians in crosswalk state. So that's where yield here to pedestrian sign would be used to support those shark's teeth markings for advanced yield to pedestrian crosswalks. And this is an illustration of what those advanced yield markings look like. So those shark's teeth apply to the roadway, and then you have this yield here to pedestrian sign, and then you have that additional warning sign with an arrow right next to the crosswalk, the continental stripes, some pedestrian scale lighting. So all of those features in combination can contribute to making the crosswalk more conspicuous, easier for the drivers to see. In-street pedestrian signs, again, depending on the state law, you would use a yield to pedestrians or stop for pedestrians sign. Here would be yield to pedestrians in crosswalk. And they go in the middle of the road. They're designed to be breakaway unless you have a median island of some kind, so they're physically elevated out of the roadway space. But if they're installed in the middle of the roadway at grade, then they have to be breakaway. And so you have to think about some maintenance issues, right? If you install those signs that are breakaway over time, you'll probably have to go back and replace some of them, but they're relatively inexpensive treatment that is effective to improve the visibility and safety of crosswalks. curb extensions, as already mentioned, those can also contribute to the crosswalk visibility and make the crossing experience more comfortable for pedestrians. So in this case, the width of the parking lanes was utilized to create this bulb out. It also gives you a nice area to put some of your street furniture in there, maybe some bicycle parking, a bench or two. And again, the parking would stop on approach to this curb bulb out. And then if you have a bike lane, you want to make sure that the pedestrian curb bulb out is not obstructing the bicycle lane. So the bicycle lane should still have the clear right of way. In some cases, putting in a curb bulb out is simply not appropriate or not right for that location. In that case, you can still think about improving your visibility of the crosswalk by removing the parked cars on approach to the crosswalk. So this blue car can obscure the driver line of sight, so you would simply mark that area in advance of the crosswalk as not applicable for parking restriction. And then thinking about lighting, the slide illustrates kind of the difference between having this light right over the top of the crosswalk that kind of results in some of the backlit conditions. It's a little bit hard to see the pedestrian. Having a pedestrian scale light on approach to the crosswalk, one on each side, really helps to eliminate the crosswalk and the pedestrians in the crosswalk much better. So again, this high visibility crosswalk it can be paired up with any number of the other pedestrian countermeasure improvements that we'll be reviewing today. So the next improvement we'll talk about is a raised crosswalk. A raised crosswalk can be quite successful, but it's not appropriate for all locations. So with a raised crosswalk, it keeps the pedestrian walkway in line with the sidewalk, and it elevates the roadway for the driver. So the driver has to come up to a higher elevation, then come back down across this. It's almost like a speed table, this elevated or raised crosswalk. So you're still going to see those warning strips on approach to the crosswalk. It's important for a visually impaired pedestrian to be able to determine that they're actually leaving the safe sidewalk space and stepping out into the road. Even though the crosswalk is elevated, they're still effectively stepping out into the road. So it's important to alert visually impaired pedestrians by utilizing those pedestrian warning strips. You still have some of the high visibility crosswalk features with the warning signs, in roadway signs, pedestrian scale lighting. So some of the other features still apply. So something to note for raised crosswalks is that they're not going to be appropriate for all locations and situations. They're really more appropriate for some of your lower speed 2 to 3 lane roadways where speed limits are 30 miles per hour or less, vehicular volumes less than 9,000 vehicles per day. So it might be a minor collector or more of a neighborhood street, kind of maybe there's some schools or other neighborhood destinations where people are trying to cross, but at the same time, it's not really the high-speed multi-lane arterial situation that we're talking about for some of the other countermeasures. And you would also want to consult with your local emergency services professionals to make sure that this raised crosswalk is not going to obstruct the path for some of the, fire trucks or possibly school buses. So additional coordination might be required. The METCD has some specific guidance regarding the signage and markings with the raised crosswalk, so how to implement those chevrons, basically the width across the top of the crosswalk table, about 10 feet. So all that information again is available in the METCD. And again, as already mentioned, you'd want to really consult with some of your emergency responders in the area. Think about whether or not there's a consideration for snow plowing or other maintenance issues that might come up. Drainage could be a consideration, right? Are you going to need some additional drainage features installed as part of this raised crosswalk? And there's a consideration or a concern that several raised crosswalks in succession could be quite disruptive to traffic. So next we're going to talk about a pedestrian refuge island. You've already seen some of those in the previous graphics and also in that Nashville example that Rochelle talked about, Nolan Pike, I believe. So pedestrian refuge island can really help improve the safety of your crosswalk by breaking up the decision for the pedestrian. They only have to pay attention basically to one direction of travel at a time. Really helps make it easier for them to pay attention to one particular direction of travel. So there's some width and length considerations with median refuge islands, pedestrian refuge islands. You want it to be at least 20 feet long in the direction of the travel to make it substantial enough that it's easier for the drivers to notice, And then you want to make sure that the width across the pedestrian path is at least 6 feet wide, and in some locations, much wider path is going to be appropriate. For example, if you have a greenway or a very popular trail crossing happening at that location, or if it's a busy downtown intersection with a lot of pedestrians, or maybe you have a variety of scooters and other users that are likely to use that location. So in some cases, 6 feet wide is really not enough, and you want to consider making it wider, but 6 feet is kind of the starting width. So the slide again just indicates the length and the width considerations. And then you can also see the pedestrian warning strips here, tactile warning strips. So there's some consideration for whether or not to add those warning strips inside the median refuge island, and that depends on how much distance you have in between them in the middle of that island. Sorry, I thought I had one more slide on that, but generally if you have at least 2 feet of clear space in between the tactile warning strips, then usually you can provide the tactile warning strips in that median refuge island. If the median refuge is so narrow that you don't quite have enough width to add the tactile warning strips and still have 2 feet of clear width, then the recommendation is to not add those warning strips in the median refuge island. Just keep it flat and level so it's ADA accessible. So the next spectacular 7 countermeasure we're going to talk about is a rapid rectangular flashing beacon. So rectangular rapid flashing beacon is usually mounted on the pedestrian warning sign next to the crosswalk with this downward pointing arrow. It includes 2 lights that flash. Now, if you have a median refuge island, you would also add those flashing beacons in the median as well. So then you'd have a set of 2 beacons on each approach, right? On this approach, you have 1 and 2, and on the other approach, you also have 1 and 2. There's usually some sort of mechanism built in, either for pedestrian to actively push a button to activate the rapid flashing beacon, or in some cases, an automated detector system was implemented, maybe infrared light that detects pedestrians crossing the path of this light, and then the beacon gets activated. So if you have those lights flashing all the time, then drivers simply get accustomed to them and they're less likely to react to them. So having that method for a pedestrian to either specifically push a button and activate the beacon, or an automated detection system built in, that's really helpful so that when the drivers see those flashing beacons with the lights actively flashing, they know that there's actually some pedestrian activity going on. So you're not just responding to a light that's flashing all the time. So in this illustration, this graphic, you also see how a rectangular rapid flashing beacon would be paired with some of those other typical features of a high visibility crosswalk. So again, you have the continental crosswalk markings, the warning signs, obviously, pedestrian skill lighting, yield here, the pedestrians in crosswalks, those shark's teeth markings. So all of those features in combination, again, can contribute to an enhanced pedestrian safety. In the old MUTCD, an RRFB was allowed as an interim approval. So generally, I think that's one of the elements that might be changing when the new MUTCD comes out.
Actually, just a quick comment on that. Currently, it is an interim approval right now. So that's interim approval 21. So in the next MUTCD, it looks like the interim approval will go away. So yeah, it is still currently under interim approval 21.
Thank you, Peter, for that clarification. As an example of a case study where RRFBs were successfully implemented and their effectiveness was monitored, Arlington County, Virginia, they implemented an enhanced pedestrian crossing with those rapid flashing beacons, and they saw a 15% reduction in speeding, 70% increase in driver yielding behavior, or I'm sorry, 110% increase in driver yielding behavior up to 70%, and then overall increase in use by pedestrians for the crosswalk location. So generally they found that this crosswalk enhancement was an effective tactic for them. So there is some data indicating that driver yielding behavior is going to vary based on the speed. So it kind of illustrates 85th percentile speed versus the percentage of drivers likely to yield. And you can kind of see that once you get above 30, 35 miles per hour, the driver yielding behavior starts to really drop off from 50% of the drivers likely to yield at 34 miles per hour down to maybe only 15% yielding at 40 miles per hour. So that's where, in your evaluation of the roadway characteristics, it might be nice to start thinking about what else can be done. Maybe a rapid rectangular flashing beacon is not really sufficient enough for higher speed situations. So that's where a pedestrian hybrid beacon might be more appropriate. So that's our next Spectacular 7 feature. I'm cognizant of time. I'm gonna go through the next two, a little bit quicker. All right, so pedestrian hybrid beacon typically is mounted on those mast arms overhead above the roadway and the crosswalk. It's usually a good idea to also pair it with those high visibility crosswalk markings and features, including lighting, continental striping. And when not activated, a pedestrian hybrid beacon is going to be blank with those three, the three light face being blank basically until a pedestrian activates the beacon. So this illustrates a different sequence of lighting. So again, starts out blank, red don't walk for pedestrian. It goes to flashing yellow when the pedestrian pushes the button to activate to request the beacon. It goes to steady yellow, indicating for the drivers that it's time to slow down and stop. And then it goes to steady red. At this point, drivers are expected to stop and not proceed and wait for the pedestrians to cross. Pedestrians get the green walk signal. At some point, the beacon will go to the wigwag pattern where the two red lights are flashing across the top. The pedestrians have a countdown timer, so they're expected to finish crossing. And then the beacon will return to a blank face condition and the pedestrians have a don't walk sign. So those pedestrian hybrid beacons have been found to be pretty effective in reducing pedestrian crashes were implemented, reducing the vehicle and pedestrian crashes by 55%. There are still some considerations for pedestrian volumes, traffic speeds, traffic volumes, and crosswalk length. This chart illustrates a consideration for where a pedestrian hybrid beacon falls in comparison with a pedestrian signal warrant. So the red line represents a pedestrian signal warrant for a pedestrian hybrid beacon where you don't quite have enough of a volume for a pedestrian signal warrant to be met, but you have the volumes, the vehicular volumes, pedestrian volumes, and speeds that are approaching the pedestrian signal warrant. That's really where a pedestrian hybrid beacon is going to be most effective. So for example, if you have on this chart 1,000 vehicles, 1,000 vehicles, not quite 100 pedestrians crossing during peak hour. And this is per hour, so 1,000 vehicles during peak hour, you might consider a pedestrian hybrid beacon. And then of course, speed is one of the factors, right? So this chart is for speeds of more than 35 miles per hour. Some of the research terms that are utilized, crash reduction factor is one of those terms. And of course, there's a CMF clearinghouse where you can look up specific countermeasures and their effectiveness in crash reduction. All right, so road diets, and I think I'm gonna go ahead and go through road diets real quickly, and I'm gonna have to come back to the LPIs tomorrow since we are at 2 p.m. So a road diet can be really an effective tool when you have roadways with volumes that are not quite enough to warrant having, for example, a 4-lane roadway. In this illustration, a 4-lane roadway was reduced down to 3 lanes with alternating left turn lane in the middle. High visibility crosswalk markings were added. A pedestrian refuge island can still be paired with a road diet, and that gives you that convenient space using the alternating left turn lane in the middle for a median refuge island. It also gives you space to provide a bicycle lane once you do the road diet. So it can be, it can have a combination of multiple benefits for a variety of users. So why would you do a road diet? Generally, it reduces the multiple threat crash types for pedestrians. It makes it easier for pedestrians to cross with a median refuge island in 2 simple steps, and it reduces the crossing distance. And of course, for bicyclists, it also has the benefit that you might be able to implement a bike lane. There are some specific guidance documents from Federal Highways, including Road Diet Informational Guide and Road Diet Case Studies. And thinking about case studies is really interesting in reviewing how different agencies are treating road diets across the country. We're seeing that there's quite a difference, but generally somewhere between 15 to 20 vehicles per day on a roadway is considered a safe zone to implement a road diet from a 4-lane to a 3-lane. But different agencies, again, treat it slightly differently, and they might require different types of analysis. So, for example, level of service analysis might be required in New Mexico and Kentucky, but might not be required in Virginia. And so, again, this parameter can kind of vary by agency from 16,000 to 20,000 vehicles per day. But generally, once you get into that zone above 20,000 vehicles per day, then most state agencies are going to be pretty hesitant about implementing a road diet, and that's where you might need to do a lot more additional traffic studies and analysis to document that the roadway can handle a road diet. So let's come back to LPIs tomorrow, since we are out of time. I apologize for kind of running over by a few minutes. Daniel, do we need to make any logistical announcements today before we adjourn for the day and come back tomorrow?
I don't think so. I mean, it's the same, just so people know, it's the same time, 11 to 1 tomorrow, and we'll be, I think, if I remember correctly, it'll be a little more interactive. Tomorrow we'll have question and answer periods as well.
Yeah, certainly for the local examples, we're hoping to have more interaction. So thanks for that, and looking forward to hopefully seeing most of you tomorrow. If you have time, come back and join us. And if you do nothing else again with this workshop, go and find your copy of Table 1 from the STEP Guide. Thanks so much, everyone. Individuals in wheelchairs. In some cases, you really might want to consider making it wider, 8 feet wide. For example, if you have a trail crossing happening at that location, that might be another factor to consider to make the median refuge island even wider. And then the slide also talks about the length of the island. So that's the length parallel to the travel lane. You would want that length to be at least 20 feet. And some jurisdictions might, of course, want to adopt their own standards. I just heard from the city of Charlotte this morning that they require 25-foot median refuge island length, but that could be location specific. At least 20 feet long is recommended. This again talks about the width in the middle between the detectable warning strips. When there's not enough width, you would not add those detectable warning strips in the island. So that 2-foot gap again is needed. Here's a couple examples. The top 2 examples have correctly not applied those detectable warning strips because the median island is too narrow. I mean, too skinny, basically, in that area where pedestrians would stand and wait. And then the bottom example, I believe there are detectable warning strips that have been applied incorrectly. To talk a little bit more about the grade of that space in the middle of the median refuge island. So you want that area to be flat in the middle, to be at street grade. And again, at least 2 feet across, and then 6 feet wide. In some cases wider, depending on how large a group of pedestrians you're expecting to accommodate on a regular basis. And then this shows a little bit of landscaping. You want to be careful with landscaping so it's not actually obstructing the view of the drivers of pedestrians in the median refuge island. In some cases, you will see those median refuge islands built with an angle so that it kind of directs the pedestrian to turn and look at the direction of oncoming traffic. So the bottom right example is actually a good example where you enter at the angle that the crosswalk is at, but then you kind of have to reorient a little bit and look to the right, the way that the median refuge island is designed. And that forces the pedestrians then to look at the oncoming traffic. But it's not recommended that you actually make the whole median refuge island at an angle. So you want to allow pedestrians to enter the island at the same angle in which they were walking, and then reorient them gently in the direction that they would need to be able to look and see if there's oncoming traffic or traffic conflicting with that movement. Just to talk a little bit more about landscaping again, some landscaping can be nice and aesthetically pleasing, but you want to be really careful with some of those taller shrubs. So the point is adding pedestrian safety. You don't want to have super tall grass shrubs that are obstructing the view of the driver. And then, of course, it's going to be hard to maintain certain plants. It's just they're going to get some of the debris, some of the salt in the winter if you're putting salt down on your roads. This is an example of hardscaped median refuge island or splitter island, an approach to a roundabout. So some brick pavers can be used to add some aesthetic elements without necessarily using landscaping. An example of a median refuge island that was implemented successfully was from Phoenix, Arizona to West Van Buren Street, where they had about a half-mile distance between signalized intersections, pretty high volume, high speed roadway. There was a marked crosswalk at this unsignalized intersection, and they had a community center just a few steps down the road. So this is what the crosswalk looked like beforehand. It had those continental crosswalk markings, but it was not necessarily super visible to drivers. So kind of no frills, basic striped crosswalk. And this is the community center. The number of lanes was 6 lanes to cross for pedestrians. So a pretty wide roadway to cross, so challenging. So the local jurisdiction was able to implement this median refuge island. They moved the crosswalk actually closer to the community center. So they broke up the crosswalk with the median refuge island in between. They added advanced stop lines on approach to the crosswalk. And then they were able to make the median refuge island longer and kind of force the pedestrians to, again, change their angle of travel to look at the traffic coming from the other direction. The advanced stop lines are not visible in this photo, but they were added. And again, this is getting pedestrians closer to the community center for those strips that were being taken to get to the community center. This slide just illustrates a little bit about how a pedestrian is able to simplify their decision-making process with the help from a median refuge island. So instead of having to scan for both directions of traffic simultaneously to check for breaks in traffic in both directions, a median refuge island simply means that a person can look to one side, one direction of traffic at first, get to the median refuge island, and then focus their attention on the other direction of traffic. So it makes the mental load a lot simpler. And so it makes it less likely that they're going to be making mistakes and misjudging the distance between cars. Wisconsin DOT is an example of a state agency that has some specific parameters around medians that they like to implement. There's a low profile barrier that they like to use. This example, again, this angled median refuge island is not something that's recommended, but in general, this could, using this raised barrier is one of the examples to build your median refuge island into this median barrier. There's just some standard drawings available from Wisconsin DOT. And you can see some landscaping here. Again, seeing those trees, you would want to minimize tall shrubs and trees on approach to your median refuge island to, again, make sure the pedestrians truly are visible. As already talked about, there was the example of temporary mid-block crossing here in Nashville, and I'm sure you all can ask Rochelle or some of the local staff about it for further detail, but we consider that to be one of the successful recent examples of implementing a median refuge island. It was paired with high visibility crosswalks, advanced markings, yield here to pedestrian signs. There were also flashing beacons added at this location. And so again, it was temporary, and I believe one of the speakers yesterday mentioned that it's been replaced with a pedestrian signal since. Just an example of a median refuge island in Asheville. Here, I would think that they might be getting close to kind of that edge where the landscaping might be getting a little bit too tall. And because the width of the median refuge island is too narrow, you see that there's no detectable warning strips applied inside the median refuge island. It's also paired with in-roadway signage, continental striping. There's another example of a median refuge island paired with a pedestrian hybrid beacon in Charlotte. In this case, the median refuge island is wide enough across to implement those detectable warning strips. This is an example of a median refuge island implemented next to a trail. Oh, sorry. Trail crossing in southwest Atlanta. I think that's part of the Beltline system or approaching the Beltline. So in this case, the median is pretty narrow again, so you see that there's no detectable warning strips in the median refuge island. This is pretty wide. I'm sure this is wider than 6 feet. I want to say it's probably 8 feet. So again, on approach to a greenway crossing might be one of those places where you'd consider making your median refuge island openings wider than 6 feet. And in this case, it's also paired with a rapid rectangular flashing beacon. Another example of median refuge island, I believe this is probably a roadway that was upgraded with a road diet at some point. There is a buffered bike lane installed, continental striping on the crosswalk, pedestrian crossing warning signs, but there's no beacons here at this location, relatively low traffic volumes. And there's some landscaping again, trying to keep those plants shorter. And this is a lot of times when we talk about the safety benefits of median refuge islands, we're specifically talking about the benefits of them at mid-block crossing locations. This is just an interesting example to me from New Orleans. This is not a mid-block location. Obviously, this is an intersection crossing that has a signal. But the neutral ground, those wide median areas and some of the roadways in New Orleans present that interesting condition where you end up basically with a very wide median. And so, of course, you can use that as part of your pedestrian crosswalk design to also create that break in the crosswalk for the pedestrians. But again, it would probably be even safer, or it would have even more benefit at a mid-block location. At a signalized intersection, you can still use median refuge islands, but we particularly would recommend them at mid-block crossing locations. And this is an interesting example. This is from Finland, so of course their signage and markings are going to be a little bit different. Europe seems to like the blue color instead of the neon green, but I thought it was interesting that some of the same principles apply. So they still have pedestrian scale lighting. You can see they left this particular median refuge island pretty wide to allow for this side path crossing. And then I guess because they get so much snow, they have little red reflector poles to indicate where the curb lines are. So some of the same principles apply. Some of the elements are different, obviously. So with that, I wanted to pause and see if there's any questions about median refuge islands or any good locations that come to mind for you all as far as where they've been implemented recently in your area, or areas that you think of implementing them in the future.
Luba, there's a couple questions in the chat, I believe, about design of the at refuge islands.
See one question from Daniel McDonald about is there guidance on vertical curb versus mountable sloped curbs for pedestrian islands? Let's see. So I think that from the ADA perspective, you want to keep the cut-through area for pedestrians flat at roadway level. So that's one of the aspects for which there's specific guidance. As far as the curb height, how high the curb would be, is it mountable, is it not mountable? I think there's probably different perspectives on that. You might want to consult your local Tennessee DOT roadway design guidance. In areas where you have a specific presence of heavier vehicles, freight vehicles, like for example, if you have a splitter island and approach to a roundabout, right, there's going to be some consideration for whether your freight vehicles are going to be able to make that roundabout turn, but usually that applies to that circle island in the middle of the roundabout. It's not really meant for pedestrians. So yeah, I think that heavy vehicles and freight vehicles, that would be one of the considerations for maybe some instances where you'd consider mountable, but for the most part, I feel like I've seen them implemented as raised curbs. Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was just typing up a long response, so I'm glad that we're taking this verbally. So I don't know of any guidance documents that says you have to go with one or the other, but typically we do like to recommend vertical, because for the mountable or slope, vehicles will go ahead and, they will mount them. And I think it's more of an application with regards to sidewalks, where mountable curbs, vehicles will be up on the sidewalk. And so that similar application, I think, if on pedestrian islands, to discourage, and it seems like a very small thing, but having that vertical curb may just discourage vehicles from mounting on top. But there's always exceptions to the rules, but I think in general, the default would be to do a vertical curb just to discourage vehicles to go up to mount it.
Thank you, Peter. And then the other question I see is, why is there a length minimum for islands? I would think that part of that has to do with just making them sizable enough to where they're more visible to drivers on approach.
Yeah, and that is a guidance. I've seen other, some locations, as you stated, 20 to 25, other places 40, but I think it is more for visibility. There isn't a actual requirement that says it has to be a certain length. As you noted, the width, I think, is the more important aspect. And I think you saw some of the examples where you had a longer length, especially if you're going to do an offset where you may have a large number of pedestrians, or maybe it's a trail crossing. You have a busy crossing where you can store more people. So you might have a longer length, even to the 20 to 25, just because there may be a lot of pedestrians and bicyclists who are needing to wait, to make that 2-stage crossing. So different applications, but I don't know if the AASHTO guide just recommends that it be 20.
Thank you, Peter. Are there any other comments or questions? I'm seeing something from Daniel, comment back on Tennessee DOT standard drawing, requiring a mountable curb. All right. Any other comments about locations that maybe come to mind for pedestrian refuge islands in your area? If so, feel free to add them to the chat.
So there's another question in regards to guidance to prevent vehicles from hitting the islands in the first place. And yeah, if islands are getting hit, I mean, the placement, obviously, depending on if it's at an intersection or if it's a mid-block type of situation, but making them visible. Maybe you can have the curb painted in a yellow, but also signing. If it's at a crosswalk location, have visibility crosswalks, which that's part of a lot of these images. You'll see that it's in combination with some of the different treatments, the recommendations, like the high visibility marked crosswalks and the signings and the pedestrian refuge islands. They all sort of work together. So I think that would be, in order for them not to hit the island in the first place, is just making them visible. But the picture that's up right now, you can see like the vegetation. That's one thing that we do, don't like to. That vegetation on the right picture is sort of high, or actually in both pictures, they're somewhat high. And so that may be blocking the pedestrians. It's good to, sort of show that there's a median island out there, but you do want to, those are considerations as far as designing. Just a quick note about the vegetation in that other image. There is in Arizona, I think it was Tucson and Phoenix, they do have some standards or guidance with regard to not placing any vegetation 30 feet to 50 feet in front of the crosswalk, just so that vegetation won't grow and that the sight lines are very clear. So there are some agencies that do have those standards actually written into their design manuals.
Thank you, Peter. All right. Well, if there's no further comments or questions, we'll proceed with the leading pedestrian interval. And, that's one of the countermeasures that we're reviewing today that is actually not typically implemented at mid-block crossing. It's more meant for a signalized intersection crosswalk location, as compared with the other spectacular 7, a lot of which really are more geared towards a mid-block or unsignalized crosswalk location. So leading pedestrian interval kind of gives the pedestrians that head start, at least 3 seconds of start time on the pedestrian walk signal at the beginning of the phase, so they have time to enter the crosswalk and be more visible to the drivers. It's often used at intersections where there's a lot of turning vehicle conflict. So maybe drivers are making a left turn with a need to yield to oncoming traffic, or there's T intersections, one-way roads, or in some of the downtown locations where you just have so much turning movement and a lot of conflicting movements. So it really helps with the visibility concern, because if the driver is trying to pay attention to the other directions of traffic, they might not be paying as much attention to the pedestrians who are about to enter the crosswalk. So getting the pedestrian out into the crosswalk enough for those 3 seconds of walk time really gives them a head start, makes them more visible, than the driver has to yield to the pedestrian crosswalk. So it's especially important to consider for your locations with higher pedestrian volumes and an incidence of crashes. You can also consider proximity to vulnerable populations, other schools, retirement communities nearby, populations who might be more dependent on transit and just more pedestrian volumes in general. They have been shown to result in a 13% reduction in pedestrian crashes. So the 3-second recommended start time is kind of a minimum. You could have longer leading pedestrian interval start time. The top right kind of demonstrates this driver trying to take a left turn across the pedestrian path of travel. The pedestrian is already in the crosswalk, far enough out there, more visible to the driver trying to take a left turn. And here we have a little video. So I'm actually going to pause my presentation and restart with the sound turned on. I think I forgot to do that when I was sharing my screen earlier.
In a rapidly growing city like Charlotte, it is critical to provide safe, convenient, and reliable transportation options. Part of that is making sure our streets are safe and accessible for people of all ages and abilities, whether they're walking, biking, or traveling by bus or car. For example, this includes improving intersections to help reduce crashes. One way we're doing that is by using a leading pedestrian interval, a new feature being added to select intersections. A leading pedestrian interval gives pedestrians a head start when entering an intersection. This makes pedestrians more visible to drivers and reinforces their priority over vehicles within the intersection. In fact, intersections with this system have been shown to reduce pedestrian vehicle collisions by as much as 60%. Here's how this system works. First, pedestrians should always press the crosswalk button when available. This lets the signal know there are pedestrians waiting to cross. Then, pedestrians get a minimum 3-second head start entering the intersection. The conflicting traffic has a red light during this time. After the leading pedestrian interval time, or head start, traffic going in the same direction is given the green light, and turning traffic yields to pedestrians who are already in the crosswalk. At intersections where heavy right-turning volumes create additional safety concerns, a no turn on red sign may also be installed. This provides additional protection for pedestrians. The City of Charlotte is dedicated to finding additional ways to increase the safety of our residents when traveling throughout Charlotte. Learn more at charlottenc.gov/transportation.
All right, some of the considerations for implementing your leading pedestrian intervals would be hardware requirements. So generally, if you've had your traffic controllers replaced relatively recently, they would probably be able to accommodate this programming to include a leading pedestrian interval. If you have really old equipment, then you might need to upgrade some of your traffic control equipment to be able to accommodate it. So for example, controller an EMA TS2 type 1 or 2, unit number 2070 or 270 should be sufficient to accommodate a leading pedestrian interval. But again, you might have some intersections with pretty old equipment where you might need to upgrade the equipment to be able to accommodate that. So that's one of the considerations, thinking about your hardware requirements. You also want to think about your visually impaired users, what to do with your left turn phasing and mode of operation, whether the intersection is coordinated for signal timing with other intersections on the same corridor. The METCD guidance indicates that at intersections with high pedestrian volumes and high conflicting turning vehicle volumes, a brief leading pedestrian interval during which an advanced walking person symbolizing walk indication is displayed for the crosswalk, while red indications continue to be displayed to parallel through and turning traffic, may be used to reduce conflicts between pedestrians and turning vehicles. So regarding the visually impaired pedestrians, one of the things that they would typically do at an intersection with a signalized crosswalk is they would listen for the sound of traffic traveling in parallel direction. So when the leading pedestrian interval is implemented, they can't hear the sound of the cars moving in the same direction yet because the cars are not yet moving. So in that case, you might want to consider whether or not it's appropriate for your location, for your context, to upgrade your pedestrian signal to audible signals as well, to make it more ADA accessible. Additional guidance from the METCD speaks to the duration. So again, at least 3 seconds But you also want to think about the width of your crosswalk, the length of your crosswalk, the typical walking speed of pedestrians in your area, especially if there's a high prevalence of senior population. And then you're trying to time it so that they can cross at least one lane of traffic. When there's a very large turning radius, you want to make sure the pedestrians can travel far enough out into the crosswalk to establish their position ahead of the turning vehicles. And I think there's some questions about the prohibiting right turn on red. You might consider prohibiting turns across the crosswalk during the leading pedestrian interval. The MUTCD does not require that. And then you might also want to consider what happens with those turning movements. If they're not able to do the turn at the very beginning of the phase because pedestrians have that leading pedestrian interval, you might consider extend the signal length beyond the pedestrian clearance time to provide turning drivers with additional green time to make their turns when the pedestrian signal is already turned off to a don't walk phase. So that's something to consider, again, depending on your turning volumes. So a question might come up, where does this extra timing come from? The general idea is that by giving pedestrians that extra time to start crossing, you're actually clearing this queue of vehicles quicker because they, again, have that head start. They can go ahead and proceed through the intersection. So in thinking about coordinating with other signalized intersections on the same corridor, you would need to consider whether or not this intersection is in free operation, in which case the length can be simply added to the overall cycle. Or is this a coordinated intersection setup, in which case you have to account for those 3 seconds or whatever timing you choose within your coordinated phase. And so in that case, the vehicular time on coordinated phase will be slightly shortened. So just thinking through locations, again, anytime you have a high prevalence of left turns with a need to yield to oncoming traffic, and you have a pedestrian signal phase at the same time, you might consider LPIs. That particularly applies at T intersections, one-way roads, and probably in a lot of downtown locations as well. It helps with visibility concern. It helps with areas with high pedestrian volumes and a prevalence of pedestrian crashes. And then again, consideration for proximity to vulnerable populations is another factor to take into account. And then you might have some additional location-specific guidance. For example, St. Paul guidance indicates that an LPI should be accompanied by a no turn on red restriction for right-turning traffic on adjacent streets, but it might need to be offset with a longer green time after pedestrian movement and still allow time for those turning vehicles. There's also guidance from St. Paul indicating that LPI should be used with a high visibility crosswalk, and accessible pedestrian signals should be considered when an LPI is used. So again, to help those pedestrians with visual impairment, if you have those accessible pedestrian signals with the audible indication, the walk sign is now on to cross X street, that really helps them too, because you can't orient for the sound of vehicles. In Charlotte, also the local guidance is that they need to have those LPI intersections need to have APS installed also, so accessible pedestrian signals with that audible indicator. A little bit more about operational considerations. So 3 seconds is the minimum, but you could go a little bit longer. In Toronto, their default is 5 seconds. In New York City, it's 7 seconds. And then you can use a formula to adjust for distance and walking speeds to, again, make sure the pedestrians have time to get far enough out into the intersection to be visible to the drivers. In some locations, they're used in conjunction with prohibition of leading left turn. That would be Toronto and Boston, for example. In some cases, they're preferred to be used on a full-time basis, such as in Boulder, and some places in Florida. And then in some places, LPIs are paired with lagging left arrow, for example, in Alexandria. But other places actually don't allow the lagging left arrow in combination with LPIs. A little bit of LPI research has been done, but it's primarily limited to CMF impacts of LPIs, safety evaluation of protected left turn phasing and leading pedestrian intervals and pedestrian safety, There's relatively little research actually on the design and operation of LPIs. A lot of the literature cites application of LPIs in other cities as kind of the state of the practice. And Austin, Texas is one of those case studies of successful LPI implementation throughout their downtown area. So they found that whereas their downtown street network is only 1% of overall street network, it accounted for 12% of pedestrian crashes and 17% of intersection-related pedestrian crashes. They went ahead and implemented LPIs at 110 of 135 downtown locations. It took them 12 person-hours to retime the signal, so a relatively small investment of staff time. All the LPIs were set for 5 seconds, and after the implementation, 87% of survey respondents felt safer crossing at those locations, and 60% of survey respondents say they were more likely to use those crosswalks knowing that it had that leading pedestrian interval. So for Austin, it was a success. And I would say 12 person-hours, there's very little that we can do in the transportation world in such a small investment of staff time and resources. All right, wanna pause here and see if there's some burning questions or some lively discussion. I feel like there's been some activity in the chat, and thanks, Peter, for jumping in on that. Trying to think if there's anything in particular not yet addressed. Looks like there was a question or comment from Rochelle about drivers who tend to use turn lanes as travel lanes frequently, and if there's any guidance on preventing that. Rochelle, are you thinking left turn or right turn lane, or both? Just kind of bypass
that was a follow-up to the Refuge Island conversation.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry. It sounds like, and it's hard to know how much time we have for everything, so but it sounds like Peter may be able to talk with us after this, unless we are able to talk about it now.
I think we have a couple minutes if you wanted to start the discussion and then continue it after the workshop as well.
Yeah. Well, with the pedestrian refuge islands, there are some, with anything really in the roadway, that are getting hit because here at least, it seems like people are pretty used to using our turn lanes as travel lanes, driving at very high speeds in the turn lane. And so it just makes it hard to put up things like pedestrian refuge islands and have them not be hit, which keeps happening at a particular location. So I don't know if there's guidance. I mean, like even what to do about it. It seems like it's a larger education campaign even that has to happen. So don't use the travel lane, or don't use the turn lane as a travel lane. So how do you do that as a city? And this is why I'm saying it's kind of a longer conversation.
Yeah, no, good point. And depending on what type, if it's a 2-lane or like a road diet with a 2-lane, in 1 lane in each direction with a 2-way left turn lane, if you put those pedestrian crossing islands out there, then you want to make sure you put those strategically, because if it is a bus route or if you have emergency services, sometimes they will go ahead and use that center lane to maybe pass. But it does discourage drivers from using a crossing island, will discourage drivers from using that as a through lane. So it does help with regards to some calming. Now, with regards to, is there some vegetation on there? I guess it depends on the design of the island itself. I don't know if maybe you can put.
No, there's nothing in it.
So maybe putting a sign.
Also on a 5-lane arterial that did not have a road diet. Okay,
so it's 2-lane each direction with the 2-way. So there is the opportunity to pass, but maybe there is certain types of, some places have put delineators around the on the ends or the signs with regards to which direction, just to be able to note that there is an island there. If there's and I don't know if there's lighting in the area as well, but if you have if it's just an island, or if you have marked crosswalks as there and with the other features, then it'd be probably pretty obvious for them to see. Now, if they're just running into it because, I don't know, for other reasons, that I'm not quite sure how we can. That's where you have to go, well, is it better to have these islands for the benefit of the pedestrians, or occasionally will vehicles, drivers who are not paying attention hit them? you don't want to make a situation worse one for the other, but I think you do need to weigh with regards to who that island is for, and maybe be able to better just be able to make it visible.
I almost wonder if having multiple pedestrian refuge islands on the same corridor would make it less likely the drivers would be trying to use the turning lane as a regular travel lane, right? As they get used to the idea like, oh, there might be some interruptions in this lane. I can't just continue down this road for too long. So yeah, I almost wonder if having more of them gets the drivers more accustomed to the fact that they just can't rely on that turning lane.
I think that's a great idea for long term, but there's so much pressure to correct this issue immediately. So anyway, it's kind of
maybe if you want, maybe we can take a look at the corridor afterwards. Let's say desktop review with Jessica and some others possibly.
Sure, that'd be great.
Great.
Thank you all.
I think, oh, just a quick note with regards to the Austin study. Great study. They did a lot of great things with the LPI there, but one issue that did come up was with regards to, there were some comments with people regarding the ADA. Not every one of those locations had accessible pedestrian signals. And so when you do, as was mentioned, LPI for the visibly impaired, they're only going to know with regards to that, it's they're getting a head start with the APS. And so, according to ADA, we can't discriminate. And so therefore, even the MUTCD states that it's a should condition, really, and you need to have APS in there. So that is just something else to be aware of, that we are just emphasizing these days with regards to LPI, and actually PHB and RRFBs. So just to make sure that you have APS.
Thank you, Peter. All right, well, I think we'll go ahead and move on to our next deep dive topic. And if you have time to come back to a couple of those other questions and comments towards the end, we might do that. So the next deep dive topic today is a pedestrian hybrid beacon. So there really are some situations where a rapid rectangular flashing beacon is not going to be sufficient due to higher number of travel lanes, speeds, higher volumes of traffic, where you need a little bit more to really get the drivers to pay attention, slow down, and stop. So a pedestrian hybrid beacon can be one of those great applications for mid-block or unsignalized crossings across those larger arterials, higher volumes, higher speeds. In this graphic, you can see an illustration with pedestrian hybrid beacon mounted on mast arms over the road. There's typically some sort of actuation device, so either a push button the pedestrian has to push, or in some cases there might be infrared detection, but I think I've seen the push button more frequently. It's paired with a high visibility crosswalk. So again, you're going to have the continental crossing markings, pedestrian scale lighting, advanced stop bar, and then next to the hog beacon face, you'll also see the sign crosswalk, stop on red, or some variation of the sign that's pretty commonly installed. So again, a little bit more about the context when a pedestrian hybrid beacon would be most appropriate. So there's still going to be situations on those multi-lane, high-speed, high-volume roadways that are probably your commercial corridors. Maybe there's a shopping center on this corridor. Maybe there's a transit line, where there's a variety of destinations, pedestrian trip generators. And the crossing location doesn't meet the signal warrant. So maybe if you measured your pedestrian volumes during peak hour, there's simply not 100 pedestrians or close to the number that the signal warrant requires. And if you implement a crosswalk, a marked crosswalk alone, even with a refuge island, it's just not enough. And at the same time, you see that there's some crash data or complaints from the public showing that there is a pedestrian safety problem. So that would be a situation where you'd consider a pedestrian hybrid beacon. This slide just illustrates, I think we reviewed this yesterday also, the phasing for the signal. So it starts with a blank face until a pedestrian pushes the button to activate the beacon, at which point it goes to flashing yellow. Pedestrians still have the stop, don't walk indicator, and then it goes to steady yellow. So prepare to stop and stop. And then it goes to steady red, at which point the drivers are expected to be stopped. And then pedestrians get the walk indication phase. So at that point, pedestrians would be crossing, and then the beacon switches to the wigwag pattern where the two lights flash across the top, which indicates to the driver so they might be able to proceed once the pedestrian has cleared the crosswalk. The pedestrians are seeing a countdown at this point, and then the beacon will return to blank phase. The pedestrian signal will return to a stop, not walk indicator. The crash reduction factor for pedestrian hybrid beacons has been found to be pretty high, 69% reduction in vehicle and pedestrian crashes. So that's a pretty effective measure. In this particular example, you see that it's implemented with a median refuge island in addition to the high visibility crossing markings. So that's generally a good idea. In some cases, you might not have enough roadway width to implement your median refuge island, so PHBs can be implemented with or without a median refuge island. Some research on PHBs has been conducted. For example, 20 PHB sites were reviewed in an open road study. The driver yielding behavior to pedestrians was on average 96%, so pretty high yielding behavior. And the study found that about 91% of pedestrians actually pushed the button to activate the pedestrian hybrid beacon at those crosswalk locations. The study also found that the speed made a difference for pedestrian behavior. So when the speed on the roadway was 45 miles per hour or higher, more pedestrians tended to push the button versus roadways with posted speed of 40 miles per hour or less. There are some guidelines in the MUTCD for different parameters of your roadway and pedestrian volumes that you might want to consider when selecting whether or not a PHB is appropriate for your location. This particular chart illustrates in red where the signal warrant falls, depending on the pedestrian volumes per hour during peak hour and the major street total both approaches vehicles per hour. So a PHB would be appropriate at pedestrian and vehicle volume slightly lower than where you'd fall with the need for a signal warrant. Some of that also depends on the length of the crossing. So depending on whether you have 100 feet of crosswalk or 34 feet, the expectations for the appropriate volumes would be slightly different. But in any case, where you have locations that are high risk for pedestrians to try and cross, and there is a demand to cross due to the presence of those pedestrian destinations, and the signal warrant for a pedestrian signal is simply not being met, then a pedestrian hybrid beacon would be a good opportunity to consider. Some of the additional guidance from the MUTCD suggests that when implemented, PHBs should be used in conjunction with signs and pavement markings to warn and control traffic. So again, try and make them as visible to the drivers on approach as possible. There's also guidance that indicates that a PHB should always be paired with a marked crosswalk. So you wouldn't want to implement the beacon without the crosswalk markings. Just another example of pedestrian hybrid beacon in Charlotte that does not include a median refuge island. There's a park on one side and bus stops on this corridor, as you can see, and that sign that says crosswalk, stop on red. So some of the guidance in the MUTCD also indicates that this crosswalk stop on red sign should be mounted adjacent to a PHB face on each major street approach. However, depending on your specific state requirements, some states choose a slightly different format for the sign. For example, school crossing signs may be used instead. Here's an example from the city of Columbus. Their signage would say, crosswalk, stop on red, proceed on flashing red when clear. I think they're maybe trying to anticipate some confusion from the drivers and trying to make it extra clear. In some cases, you might be able to implement pedestrian hybrid beacons on posts on the side of the road instead of mounting them overhead. There might be some cost savings associated with this implementation approach. This is an example from Las Cruces, New Mexico. You can see they're mounted on each side. There's also some question about whether or not pedestrian hybrid beacons can be implemented in an intersection. There's some guidance in the current MUTCD that when an engineering study finds that installation of a pedestrian hybrid beacon is justified, then the PHB should be installed at least 100 feet from side streets or driveways controlled by stop or yield signs. However, this is guidance, not a standard. Currently, there is a push to remove this guidance from the MUTCD, and there is a proposal to make the next standard so that if a pedestrian hybrid beacon is installed at or immediately adjacent to an intersection with a side road, vehicular traffic on the side road shall be controlled by stop signs. And Peter, feel free to chime in if you have any further news about the MUTCD, but I think our expectation is that that guidance will be removed most likely.
Yep, correct.
Also, something to note is that a lot of the guidance, or one of the first jurisdictions to implement pedestrian hybrid beacons pretty widely was Tucson, Arizona. And in Tucson, they were actually implemented at local street intersections pretty frequently. So some of the state supplements have eliminated this guidance, including Arizona, for example. Also, some of the locations in Charlotte where I've seen PHBs implemented are at intersections. So then you have a question about what do you do with the side street approach if they are implemented at an intersection. From the IT Traffic Control Devices Handbook, there's some guidance that if a PHB is used at an intersection or driveway, then the PHB crossing and signal equipment should only control one crossing. So for example, if you have two legs of this intersection with a crosswalk across the main road, you would only implement the PHB across one of those legs, not both. Florida was one of the case studies where PHBs were implemented quite successfully. Division 7, the FDOT installed 3 PHBs along Hillsborough Avenue in the fall of 2015. Sorry, this is just an example of that one of the locations. You can see that they did use the overhead mast arms to install pedestrian hybrid beacons. And previously to installation, they were seeing on average about 20 crashes per year. After implementation 2016, they installed the PHBs in the fall of 2015. So by 2016, this number of crashes, bicycle and pedestrian crashes, dropped to 7. So they considered to be a success. This was preliminary crash data, and unfortunately, I don't have updated crash data in front of me for that location. There's also an opportunity to use driver education campaigns in conjunction with PHB implementation, especially if you haven't had too many instances of a PHB being implemented in your region, in your area, in your municipality. Sometimes drivers might be confused if they encountered for the first time. So here you see an example, a little handout that would tell the driver what different phases of the PHB would mean. So for example, both lights red would be stop for pedestrian, flashing red is stop, and then proceed with caution if clear. So some locations have done like little bus stop advertisements and billboards to let both pedestrians and drivers know about this treatment. Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina was an example where PHBs were implemented and evaluated for effectiveness on US 76 at North Channel Drive. A PHB was installed at existing crosswalk in 2013. This crosswalk serves an elementary school in the beach community. So you can see again, they were implemented on mast arms on top of the road. So the study looked at the driver behavior and pedestrian behavior. They observed the location for about 20 hours. 460 pedestrians and bicyclists were crossing this corridor during that time. They did find, and there's also some additional data about the location, that there is an elementary school within a third of a mile. There'll typically be a crossing guard during school start or prior to school start and after dismissal. Speed limit is 35 miles per hour with a 25 miles per hour school zone speed limit. So they looked at this location, the summarized observation data into 4 zones. And then they looked at what percentage of pedestrians and bicyclists actually use this crosswalk in addition to driver yielding behavior. So they saw that the crosswalk use increased from 45% to 49%. So more people were likely to self-select to actually use the crosswalk location with the PHB. About 51% actually activated the PHB. And then driver compliance increased from 27% to 74% during PHB activation. But even without the activation of the beacon, when the pedestrians did not push the button, there was still an increase in driver compliance from 27% to 36%. So having those additional signage and markings overhead just alerts the drivers more that there's something going on, and they're more likely to slow down, pay attention. And then, of course, having a crossing guard at that location, having them be present also helped with the driver and pedestrian behavior. So the crossing guard would actually push the button to activate it when there was a group of pedestrians approaching. And let's see, there's one more case study in Little Rock, Arkansas. They looked at kind of before and after again. They looked at whether or not there were different locations along this corridor that met the criteria for implementing, whether or not there were sufficient available gaps in traffic, looking for average of 1 gap per minute or 60 gaps per hour. So one of the locations met their guidance and one did not. And they also looked at the pedestrian signal warrant to see whether those locations would meet some of the signal warrants. Warrant 6, coordinated signal system, actually what was met at one of the locations as well. So even though it didn't meet the pedestrian volume warrant, it met a different warrant. So I believe they actually decided to go with the signal implementation at that location. This illustrates a little bit more about one of the locations where they had bus stops with benches and shelters. This is a location of the crosswalk. They added high visibility crosswalk markings, traffic signal, pedestrian accommodations. And then actually they upgraded the bus stops to add those benches and shelters. So I think that's all the information on the PHBs that I have. So I wanted to pause and see if we have some discussion on this before we jump into local case studies. Peter, thank you for addressing some of the questions in the chat box already.
Sure. And actually, I was wondering if Daniel had a question as far as what if you don't have pedestrian volume data? So you want me to, I don't know if you want to take that one first or you want me to?
Well, I think as planners, we would love to see more data being collected, right, on pedestrian volumes as much as possible. So, and I think it depends on how many locations are you talking about. Is it just one location, Daniel, or is it multiple locations where you don't have the pedestrian volume data?
We actually don't have pedestrian volume data for any locations. Usually we are looking to partner with TDOT. They have a pedestrian counts, active transportation counts program. So going forward, we should have in the next year or so, should have access to infrared counters, but right now we don't have that data.
But you do know that at certain locations there is a pedestrian demand.
Yeah, we do have latent demand data. We do have access to that. But I just was wondering if you're looking to implement a PHB, then how do you decide on that at a certain location if you don't have access to pedestrian volume data?
Yeah, so oftentimes you can go out, a lot of agencies, they'll go do those counts, maybe by person, but depending on what your resources are available. But if you said if you had latent demand, you can do that engineering in the study. You can note that you do have confidence that if you put in a PHB that there would be that demand. I think that's the one issue with regards to PHBs is that although it is guidance with regards to having 20 pedestrians, per hour, that a lot of places people don't want to cross at these locations because they're multi-lane, high speeds, and they feel that they're at risk, and they only do so if they absolutely have to. And so therefore there is a lot in latent demand. And if you can note that when in the engineering study, oftentimes we see that after you put in a PHB, then it usually meets those volumes or even higher. It's in the same way that, the great example I always, I've heard and I repeat is the fact that how many cars cross over that bridge before the bridge is put in. And so in the same way, you're doing analysis as far as origin destination, or if you're seeing people that are crossing at a certain location consistently. Other times, people will do surveys in a neighborhood and talk to them and say, you know, if we put in a traffic control, a PHB here or RFB, would you use it? And so you can do neighborhood surveys as well. So that's but since you already, I think you mentioned you have the latent demand, some of that, but more for the benefit of others that haven't done that. Those are different ways that you can get that information.
Thank you, Peter. Trying to see if there's any additional questions. A comment from Robert about the problem of adjacent side street traffic control, artificially generated by the warrant requirements for full traffic signalization. If ped safety was prioritized and fully signalized crosswalks would be installed based on ped safety, and there would be no problem with side street control. Thank you for that comment.
Yeah, and so with regards to warrants, you know, that is the one thing we've heard discussion with regards to possibility of getting, you know, warrants out of there altogether. I don't know where that will go. That's where this comment period, it would be helpful for people to make those comments in there. And but I will say, you know, it is a challenge if you put signals, you know, if they got rid of warrants and, you know, had no pedestrian volume requirements for signals, then, you know, you may end up getting requests for every, you know, intersection or a lot of intersections being signalized. And I think that's where the step treatments are really helpful, because sure, there are locations where a signal would be probably ideal, but signals are not, you know, guarantee as far as pedestrian safety. Sometimes having traffic, you know, a good design in a mid block with a PHB or RFB could actually be probably even more effective and efficient for all modes. And that is the thing about engineers. It's like most places where I've gone to do these workshops, it's not that the engineers don't want to do some of these things, but they've got a job of trying to balance all the different users. And so I think, you know, understanding the different sides and the needs really is helpful. But with the PHB, it does, you know, provide that, you know, the lower threshold. And it is at, you know, you can put it at an intersection. You want to do that study and justify why you're doing it, and it'll be easier in the next edition as far as the recommendations go. But it does not control that intersection. I think in the past, historically, because of half signals, which at an intersection, it stopped control, and then the main main roadway is with a signal. There have been traffic crashes with vehicles. I think maybe, you know, it's been a while, and I don't know if drivers are getting better with that, but we don't want to make something more, you know, unsafe for one mode and make it safer for one. We want to try to make sure we balance all that out. So it's sometimes it's a bit challenging, but I do agree, you know, with probably Robert and others that we should be, if we're looking at safety and the most vulnerable, then as far as delays and prioritization, you know, we can do much better in that area. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peter. And just to note that Nashville does have Vision Zero action plan underway, so kudos to Nashville for undertaking the Vision Zero initiative, where pedestrian safety will certainly be highlighted. I also wanted to highlight that a lot of the resources are available from Federal Highway Safety website, including this additional information on specific details for pedestrian hybrid beacons and some of the other countermeasures we reviewed. So feel free to go check out those resources. And with that, we're going to jump into local case studies. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the case study examples, and I'm going to invite our local presenters to jump in to help review those. Sorry, just a second. All right, pulling it up. It looks like the first example we have is Mount Juliet Road at Adams Lane. This particular slide doesn't actually tell me the jurisdiction, but if you're with the local jurisdiction, I would like to help provide a little bit more background on this location.
Yes, this is Andy Barlow, City of Mount Juliet. I can help provide some background here. Would you like me to go ahead and get started?
Yeah, if you would please, thank you. And I'm sorry, you just introduced yourself, but would you just let us know what jurisdiction is this in?
City of Mount Juliet.
Mount Juliet. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. The intersection here is Mount Juliet Road, which is a state route, 171. We have a couple of different slides here kind of comparing what's happened. From 2006, this was actually only an intersection with Adams Lane. There was a realignment of the roadway, Belinda Parkway on the east side, and that was done in, it was farther to the north. There was some interchange reconfiguration there, additional ramps done. Interstate 40 is just to the north, so very close proximity to the interstate itself and the ramps as well. About, I think, 2007, you can see the dirt being moved there. On the southeastern quadrant of this intersection is Providence Marketplace. It's a major regional shopping, dining area that we have. That was constructed, it was under construction in 2006. I think the majority of that opened in about later 2006, 2007. The roadway realignment was done. You can see in the 2019 image there. That's the configuration as it sits today. And so you can see the changes there over time. Really, the vast majority of all these changes happened within about, I'd say, 4 years or so. And so the let's see, this intersection, I would say it probably South Mount Juliet Road, farther south of here. TDOT does have accounts, but it's past the Providence Marketplace. My estimates are that this has about 40,000 vehicles per day through this intersection. We have a very heavy southbound movement coming from the interstate, and also there's a lot of northbound trips as well, which you can see the 3 southbound lanes, 2 southbound lefts. You have 2 northbound lanes, 1 northbound left, and then Adams Lane on the would be the eastbound approach as a lane in each direction. And then as it sits today, Belinda Parkway, or Providence Way as it's named, in this area has dual right turn lanes and a through and a left turn. And those, we'll probably go to the next slide and kind of show a little bit of a more incremental changes. It actually shows the change that we had from adding those dual right turn lanes that have very, very heavy movement. Peak hour volumes for that right turn can be over 1,000 vehicles. So that was added later, well, actually probably 2017 is when that was added. Other changes to this intersection, I think it was early 2017, late 2016, this intersection along with several around it was changed over to adaptive signal control technology. But no changes since the 2 of those projects. Overall signal operations here, we have leading southbound lefts. Typically, it is an adaptive signal. It can change. We do normally have a lagging northbound left. We have flashing yellow arrow for that movement. We have overlaps, right turn overlaps as well for the side streets. So you can anticipate there's a heavy southbound left and heavy westbound right movements there. So those we do have those overlapping movements as well. I think that gets the gist of it. Let me know if you have any questions on that.
Is that the last slide? Yeah, looks like it is. Has there been a prevalence of pedestrian crashes at this intersection, or what's happening with some of the activity generators and destinations in this area?
Maybe some folks from GNRC may be able to discuss that. Daniel, not sure if you might be able to give a little bit more insight on that one. I wasn't aware of as much on the issues there from the pedestrian crashes, but I do know it was selected on this to be analyzed.
Ashley, do you want to go in quickly to why this area showed up as a hotspot?
Yeah, of course. It's not necessarily to say that all of the crashes are occurring in this exact intersection. What it's saying is that the way that we typically look at areas is we look at about a 10-acre area and we sum them up to try to look at it at a regional scale, so across the 7 counties, and just this area in general, the hotspot. And if I'm not mistaken, there's a large shopping center on the other side of this, somewhere close by, and there's also greenways and trails and subdivisions. And so my guess, without having the crashes pulled up right in front of me, is that a lot of people are walking from those greenways or walking from those subdivisions over to those shopping centers, restaurants, and those sorts of things, is my guess. I would have to pull those up and take a closer look, but that's the issue with some of these areas, is it's not necessarily they're all happening in this intersection in particular. They're happening in this vicinity. They're happening in this region or in cross streets next to this. That helps bring some light to that.
Actually, one thing I will add there is we do have a prevalence of hotels on the western side of the corridor. You're correct. Just to the southeastern side of this image is Providence Marketplace. So you do have that. You have generally, I think all but one of our hotels are on the western side. You have a few restaurants on the west side, but then I think on the bottom right corner here, you have Red Lobster there and several others. We call it Restaurant Row. And so there is, I could imagine, quite an interaction between hotels on the western side of the intersection and restaurants and goods and services on the east side.
Thank you. And Andy, did you already mention the traffic volumes? Do we know the volume on the main road versus crossroad here?
TDOT traffic counters are a little bit farther south of this intersection, where it goes down to 2 lanes. So it's actually south of Providence Marketplace. It's around 20,000 ADT. Further south of there, I can imagine in this area, it's significantly higher. Obviously, we have a large amount of trips to and from Belinda Parkway, Providence Way on the east leg. Also Providence Marketplace itself. Significant housing developments over the last, I'd say 10 to 15 years. Behind Providence Marketplace, that includes several apartment complexes as well. And so I would assume volumes here are around 40,000. We don't have an updated count. I know that we did counts. I was probably 2016 is the last time that we did counts at this particular intersection.
Thank you. Let's see. Maybe a question for the audience. If somebody sees opportunities to get more information about this location, if you're, for example, just starting a brand new safety analysis of this intersection, who might be some of the stakeholder groups in the area you would consider talking to? Are there maybe community organizations you tried to talk to, or would you talk to the transit agency? Not even sure if there's any bus stops here. Feel free to add your comments to the chat box. I think this is an example where there's still a lot of unknowns about this intersection, so you probably want to try and collect a little bit more data, even if the crash data is already existing. For example, I'd be curious to see if there's any plans to redevelop the northeast quadrant of this intersection. Looks like a pretty wide open field right now, but I'm assuming this is a fast-growing region, so might not be an open field for a long time. Might be changing to something soon.
Yeah, the northeastern quadrant there, there are some Trans-Canada gas transmission lines that go under right there, and it really bleeds into right-of-way as well. So right away for the interchange. Of course, the old road realignment, or the old road alignment, was a little bit farther to the north. I think, to my understanding, that area is all right of way.
Okay, so it might stay greenfield for a long time in that case. If it's all gas pipelines with kind of protected right of way above them.
Liuba, this is Daniel from GNRC. I wondered if you all on VHB side could, based on the information that Andy and Ashley provided, tell us a little bit about what countermeasures would make sense in this location.
Sure, thank you. And I see that Peter added to the chat box that he would recommend consideration for a roundabout. I would assume that would be a 2-lane roundabout with traffic volumes approaching 40,000 vehicles per day. So yeah, a 1-lane roundabout is probably not going to work at this location. But yeah, certainly a roundabout with some additional protective measures such as median refuge islands and the splitter islands. You might need to consider additional measures to make sure that those pedestrian crosswalks across the roundabout approaches are safe. If you are not going to implement a roundabout, then I think for me, one of the questions is what's going to be changing with the roadway context as well, right? Are you planning to widen this intersection further, or is this kind of about set for now? No new roadway projects coming. And then I think you could definitely improve the existing conditions. I can't tell if there's pedestrian signal heads, but you could start with the basics of high visibility crosswalk markings, right? So I think somebody already put in the chat. Oh, Jessica, thank you, Jessica, with Federal Highways. Continental crosswalk striping, high visibility crosswalks, add pedestrian signal heads if you don't already have them. You could probably look at tightening the turning radii just slightly. I'm not sure, depending on your heavy vehicle volumes, you might be able to do something about tightening those curbs just a little bit to slow down the drivers a little bit on this as they take in those turns. And you can kind of see this painted median. There might be an opportunity to extend it a little bit closer. Maybe actually make it a concrete median island to give pedestrians that median refuge island. Of course, you have the turning lanes there too, so you kind of have to look at the geometry, but it may be possible to, again, extend this painted median to make it into a median refuge island and still give the turning vehicles space around that. And then consider that, I guess, for other approaches as well. Is there an opportunity to break up this crossing, because they're all such wide crossings, so very long distance for pedestrians to try and cross. And then depending on your conflict between pedestrian volumes and right turn, left turn vehicles, you could consider an LPI or prohibition of right turn on red. You'd probably want to look at your, again, existing patterns and volumes a little bit more to see what else is going on. I see a suggestion from Ross in the chat box to look at the presence of bicycle clubs, whether there's maybe group bike rides in the area. Comment from Robert about the example of this type of development. Peter, are you trying to add something?
This is Andy. I was going to add that yes, I think there was a question about bike lanes. Yes, we do have bike lanes. As you can see in the 2019 image, that section of South Mount Juliet Road was resurfaced. And with that, we, the local agency, made the request to TDOT to narrow the travel lanes to provide a 2-foot buffer on the bike lane. So we did have that. As you can see north, it really is not clearly marked. It's there. You can see it easier on the southbound movement. There is bike lanes. However, there's a gap over the interstate. We are working in coordination with TDOT. TDOT actually lit the project. It's currently under construction to widen the bridge. It has a unique traffic configuration as it sits today in the bridge over the interstate. And with that, we took the opportunity to actually add bike lanes as well as buffered bike lanes as well as sidewalks across the bridge. It does not exist today, just a shoulder. Along with that, pedestrian handrails along the bridge itself. It was the missing link on Mount Juliet Road. Everywhere else within the city limits that has been widened in the past has bike lanes. In fact, we have buffered bike lanes north of the interstate as well with a prior resurfacing project. And so that is, but I really like, yes, and I saw the other question on the with BPAC. We do have Mount Juliet BPAC as well. And so very involved, very active group. And so fortunate to have that here as well. Yeah, I like the idea of shortening up. I think if there's one thing that I've seen that's pretty classic examples that we've seen are having the curb ramps in the center of the radius, which makes for really long crossing distances. I think if there's one thing that that I've been big on trying to see us move in a direction of is shortening up some of these crosswalk distances wherever we can. If it's a splitter islands, anything like that we can find, refuge islands, anything that we can do. I like the recommendation of the refuge island, at least on the south side of the intersection there. I think that could be doable. We do have another widening project. It's further south. It's not really going to affect this intersection, but it ends about at this intersection on the south side. That could be something that, geometrically speaking, I think that we might be able to do. I'm going to have to check and see what the design looks like there, though.
Yeah, I think this is a good example where you might need to have a little bit more data and kind of zoom out a little bit more to see what else is happening in the area. Just looking at this intersection screenshot, it's hard to know, for example, that there is an interstate crossing right nearby, or there's another roadway project to the south, right? So if you're actually a jurisdiction considering improvements here, you'd probably want to look at a little bit zoomed out view as well and see what else is happening in the area, what other projects are planned and programmed, what are the specific destinations, and where are you seeing some of those patterns of pedestrian crashes occurring, right? Maybe a mid-block crossing location really makes more sense depending on proximity to where you're seeing those crashes and specific destinations. Yeah, thanks for that Ariel.
Can I make a comment? In Robert actually made a great comment in the Robert Johnson. A lot of this, in my work with the Spectacular 7, it seems like we do a lot of retrofitting, trying to solve problems that are already there. And even though the Spectacular 7 can be implemented early on in the planning stages, a lot of it is trying to be reactive rather than proactive. And Robert makes a great point with regards to, their traffic engineers are trying to meet ever increasing vehicle demands, as he states. But, we don't really think as much as far as the pedestrian and bike demands, the other modes. And at the federal level, we're trying to, right now with Secretary Pete, we're trying to make those shifts, or people are trying to make those shifts. And so really it does start at the planning stage. If you can plan these things out and think about all the users from the very beginning at the planning stages, it just makes it so much easier. And as you stated, we can't see the rest of the aerial here, but it seems like there's opportunity. There's opportunities with regards to being able to maybe put in some other features with regards to peds and bikes, but maybe that was more, thought afterwards. Just putting in a sidewalk and, possibly is there a room, if you did the planning, could there have been a separated path in some of these situations? So just wanted to note that, Robert makes a very good point there, and I think getting a lot of thumbs up there. So it's better to do it in the planning early on if possible.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and move on to our local case study number 2. This is the City of Gallatin, West Main Street and Cemetery Avenue. So at this point, if you have a local staff representative for the City of Gallatin with us, I'd invite you to give us a little bit more information about this intersection if you're able to.
Well, this is Bill McCord over in Gallatin. I'm the city planner, and I think Nick Tuttle, our city engineer, is also attending. If Nick, if you could chime in, let me know that you're here, then I'll limit some of my presentation to you, hopefully a lot of it. Are you there, Nick?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can now.
Great. Hey, this is your show, Bill.
All right, Nick, you chime in because on some of the details of design you were involved in and continue to be involved in. So this is a intersection in Gallatin on the west side of our downtown area. Can everybody hear me? I want to clarify that.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is the intersection of two state highways, actually a federal highway, US 31 and Highway 25. It looks like it's improperly, Google improperly labeled it as 386. It's actually 174 Highway 25 coming in from the west side, and 25 proceeds eastward through the downtown, the core of the downtown area, and US 31 comes from the southwest to the northeast there. So US 31 is a 5-lane and 4-lane divided roadway in this area, and Highway 20, I'll call it Highway 25, is essentially a 4-lane undivided or 3-lane section from east of the major intersection here, and west of the intersection it is a 2-lane arterial roadway, and we also have some railroad tracks. Both the branch line is the first railroad track, so it gets sporadic use, but then we have a main line which gets a lot of use with long trains, frequently long trains, not too far from the intersection. So that creates some operating problems when the train's coming through, grade level crossings. So what we have is on Highway 31 southwest, there's about 25,000 or a little bit more average annual daily trips. And then northeast on that, it falls off to about 19,000. And Highway 25 east is at capacity at about 15, a little over 15,000 daily trips. And then to the west, it's essentially over capacity, carrying about 17,000 daily trips. So we got some operational concerns here. We have a split phase signal for Highway 25, and then the phases work together on Highway 31, northeast, southwest to northeast. This is a photograph from 2009, and there's been some changes that took place, and I think the next photograph demonstrates some of those changes with some streetscape improvements, primarily on the eastern side of the intersection, which made some sidewalk improvements and some lane striping. One thing that's unique about this intersection is that as you travel eastbound, I'll call it east or northeast bound on Highway 31 onto Highway 25, you have a continuous right turn lane with no signal control, and essentially that's a just free flowing right turn lane that does not require a merge. So traffic that's coming on Highway 25 or through the intersection on Highway 25 eventually has to merge over into that free flow lane into a single lane as you continue heading east. With this improvement also, they provided a southbound left turn lane improvement, and of course the sidewalk improvements. There were no pedestrian crossings installed at this time when this was done, and this is again a major intersection, as you can tell. The uses around it, there's a fast food restaurant, Crystal, on the northeast side. At that time there was a gas station, convenience store on the northwest side, used car lot and pawn shop on the southwest side, and then difficult to get to a variety of things, payday loan. It's not always the greatest of uses in this area, but, and then there's a creek that goes underneath, that's buried underneath the Crystal, essentially bridged on the east side of the intersection. So a lot going on here. Pedestrian movements primarily from the east towards the north, I guess, and then towards the west. Because of the railroad track and the limited number of crossings that we have on the railroad, people who do walk and or bike, and of course motor vehicles as well, are funneled across a large area to the northwest across the railroad track in this area. So you don't have a pedestrian way once you get west of the spur line railroad along Highway 25. There is no sidewalks at all. And of course, there's no sidewalks in the railroad right of way either. We have sidewalks on Highway 31, north and south, and of course now nice sidewalks, pretty nice sidewalks on Highway 25 east of the intersection. But at this time in 2011, when they did this improvement, there were no pedestrian improvements. And then I think the next slide, if we can go there. The next slide, yes, this was done in, I can't remember when it was done, about 2015 or 16 maybe. Nick, you chime in there. But what was done was some improvements were made to the intersection with mast arm signals and pedestrian crossings with textured pavement that was placed in there, stamped pavement, and then it was colored, the kind of the rust color that you see there. So in conjunction with the signal changes that were done, the crosswalks were installed on 3 legs of the intersection, including a unsignalized but of course marked sidewalk crossing that free-flowing right turn lane there from 31 to 25. And one of the unusual things that was occurring, or at least at the time of this slide was taken, is that the gas station on the northwest side was transitioning over to another payday loan place. And that intersection there, because of the unusual angle, had a pedestrian, or has a pedestrian push button there on that northwest corner that always gets clipped by large trucks, or had always gotten clipped by large trucks. So large trucks turning from Highway 31 onto Highway in 25, I'll call it, or it's marked with 174 here, it have difficulty in making that turn, and actually they encroach into the radius of that sidewalk there. We have made arrangements to try to fix that at a future date when this business changed to from a service station to a payday loan, to identify an area where we would could acquire additional right of way to move that and widen that radius. Of course, that's good and bad, depending on which way you look at it. But this put the pedestrian improvements in on all 3 legs, but not on the south leg of the intersection. So one who's walking along the south side of Highway 25 that wants to continue walking on Highway 25 has got to cross 3 different legs of the intersection, in addition to that free-flowing lane. But it does now have pedestrian improvements. Now, one thing that happens also, because the Crystal is an attractor for people, and there's a Wendy's there just to the east of the intersection, you probably can pick that out, is that we have people who want to cross this road, Highway 25, and they're not willing to go back and essentially double back and use the crosswalks. They'll just walk across the neck of the intersection there, somewhere between the Crystal and the Wendy's there. So maybe a couple 100 feet east of the intersection, they are just jaywalking across at that point. That may be one of the areas of concern that we have, and how to alleviate that other than putting a median in. Obviously, Wendy's would not be real happy blocking their driveway for people trying to turn into their site if we were to do that. So I'm not sure. The folks at GNR, Ashley maybe has some information about accidents, that are pedestrian and or bicyclist accidents. There is no bike lane on Highway 31, and there is no bike lane on Highway 25. And there's a possibility that one could, when they resurface the road, that could be installed, because there is some area, slight, I wouldn't call it a paved shoulder because it's a curved road, but there's an opportunity to do that with bike lanes, and we try to take advantage of that when that occurs. So that's the unusual aspects that we're looking at here. We're hoping that this area is going to be transitioning and be redeveloping for the most part. There's a lot of uses in here that are probably not the long-term best interest of the development of downtown. The creek that I mentioned that was buried underneath the parking lot of Crystal and goes under Highway 25 is in a floodway, has a floodway and a flood zone associated. So this whole intersection's in a flood zone, at least at this time. And there's some improvements being considered that may change the status of that. But there's going to be some aspect of a flood zone and a floodway associated with that creek, no matter what happens. So that's kind of the situation we have here. And it's a very important intersection in our community. And we have made some improvements, but there's probably a lot more that we could do.
And Bill, would you restate the traffic volumes of this intersection for my benefit? I think you mentioned 15,000 on one of the approaches, and I'm curious if there's actually enough right-turning vehicle volumes on this slip lane to actually justify having the slip lane. So if you have any more traffic data to share, that'd be great.
Well, those aren't directional volumes. Those are two-way average daily trip volumes, a little over 15,000 on the Highway 25 east leg of the intersection, and about 25 to 26 on the Highway 31, about 17,000 on Highway 25 that goes over the railroad tracks, the west leg, and then the north leg, I think it was 19 or something like that. And all those are daily trips. But there is a heavy volume of right turn movement from Highway 31 onto Highway 25 east. I don't know what that number is. I would think maybe engineering. Nick, you may know what actual volume is. I don't know that they've actually done a count just to indicate, or if we have a traffic study that indicates what that volume is. But it's pretty heavy. There's a lot of right turn at that intersection. And therefore, that's why it's free flowing.
I don't know what the number is, Bill. I know when the intersection was suggested to be discussed today, we were talking about West Main Street at Cemetery Avenue, so I didn't go back and pull those plans to see what that the turning movements were at the intersection.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Main Street, 31E.
Oh, and you're right. I'm focused on the
right
main
here.
intersection.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a local street, Cemetery Avenue, and it's part of a little bit of what I discussed about people jaywalking. That's generally they're coming up Cemetery Avenue. A lot of them are, and jaywalking across the street without using the crosswalks.
Great. And I'd be curious, maybe Ashley has a little bit more perspective for us on the pedestrian crashes that have been documented at this location. Is it obvious that there is this prevalence of mid-block pedestrian crossing-oriented crashes?
Yeah, I think that most of them actually were mid-block and not actually at that intersection, which was really hard for us to figure out how to name the intersection because they were occurring along those roads, like in a linear fashion.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of them were happening not in the intersection themselves.
Okay.
So would you say there's kind of general hotspot between this intersection with Gallatin Pike and Locust Avenue, this whole stretch?
Yeah, I'll have to pull up the crash data and take a look at it more thoroughly. I'll drop a link to our application that has all of these locations in there, and you can pull up crash locations. I wasn't prepared to speak on those, so I will drop that link in there for you.
It looks like we're getting some discussion in the chat about the potential to extend the greenway through here and kind of revitalize the creek, maybe daylight sections of the creek and make it more of a focal point for the community. As Bill has mentioned, it goes under Highway 25 currently through here, under this, is that the Crystal parking lot?
Yes.
Large parking area.
Yeah, and that's certainly a possibility to acquire that and provide a greenway extension through there. We have a greenway that's built to the northeast of here, and this would be a critical link. It'll be a challenge, no doubt, and providing a crosswalk will probably have to incorporate the existing crosswalk at the intersection there, the main intersection, as opposed to building one 100 feet back from the intersection where the creek currently is underneath the road there. And that wouldn't be the thing we'd want to encourage.
Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to figure out from the aerial, is US or Highway 25 mainly one lane in each direction plus some turn lanes through here? Just having a hard time reading those lane markings there.
It's a 4-lane undivided road that transitions at Locust Street to essentially a 3-lane section with the center turn lane.
Yeah,
Once
and
you
if
get
the
to Locust-
traffic volumes are still, you mentioned around 15 to 17,000 on
Yes,
on Highway 25. So I wonder if there's an opportunity to extend this 3-lane cross section further west to this key intersection, even possibly further, if that's an opportunity, because then it would make any sort of crossing improvements a little bit easier, most likely.
well, it kind of functions more when you're on the westbound approach on Highway 25 to the 31 intersection. Is one of the lanes is a through and a right lane, and the left lane is a dedicated left turn lane onto Highway 31. So it really functions as a longer left turn lane than what you have there. So putting a 3-lane section in there, considering that you have that heavy volume eastbound, may create more conflicts. It's very awkward as it is now because the free flow right turn lane doesn't yield to through traffic coming through on Highway 25. It's kind of the opposite.
This movement.
Yeah, they do not yield to the traffic coming through the intersection. They have the opportunity. The people coming through the intersection on Highway 25 have to merge into the right lane because the right lane becomes a dedicated left turn lane at Locust Avenue. So through movements have to merge into the right turn lane or the right lane.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a reason for doing it that way, or could it be shifted to where you are forcing those right turning vehicles to merge into the main line of traffic? Just change the striping up a little bit, and possibly if you can't extend the 3-lane section all the way to the intersection, could you extend it to one of those side streets to Hickory Avenue or Cemetery Avenue?
Yeah, I don't. The volumes are so high, and it doesn't show in this photograph that if you did that, where they had to merge or essentially yield to through movements, then you really have a big backup on 31. It's that many vehicles that. Nick, you might jump in here and kind of explain that.
I think you're explaining it well, Bill. There's a lot of queue that builds up going in the western direction on Highway 25. And then, just as you said, you got a very large right turning volume from Highway 31 onto 25. And you don't want that backing up onto Highway 31E, being the even more traffic on Highway 31E.
Yeah, so it sounds like you might need a little bit more further traffic evaluation to see whether some of those road diet elements are possible, or whether it's possible to modify the right turn slip lane. Generally, those slip lanes are not great for pedestrian safety. But it also sounds like, based on the presence of pedestrians crossing and the crashes, you kind of have a mid-block crossing issue a little bit more so than the crossing at the intersection. So you might kind of have to have this bifurcated approach, right? If you look at both how to improve the intersection for pedestrians, but also look at whether it's feasible to add that mid-block crossing location, maybe not right in front of Wendy's, but could you shift a little bit east or west? And look at kind of your concentration of crashes in terms of, and where your queue lengths kind of build up, and where it makes the most sense to add that mid-block crossing location. And I would think that based on your volumes, you might consider a pedestrian hybrid beacon at that point in combination with a mid-block crossing and a median refuge island. So certainly having road diet elements would make any sort of mid-block crossing a little bit simpler, right? The more narrow the road gets, the more you slow down and kind of traffic calm your traffic, the easier it will be to get people across safely. But even if you're starting with this 4-lane cross section, maybe there's room to add a median refuge island if you're talking about a mid-block crossing. And then, yeah, this right turn slip lane certainly think that's a problem area for pedestrians, and I would look at adding the high visibility crosswalk markings at the intersection. Looks like right now you have stamped pavers or red brick pavers across the crosswalk.
Yes.
Is that correct? And is that kind of local design preference? Is that kind of the style that you're using throughout your downtown area?
Yes. Is that right, Nick? I think it's correct.
Yeah, we kind of go back and forth between actual brick to a concrete stamped colored. It looks like brick, and then what you're seeing at the intersection of Highway 31E and 25, and also at Locust and 25, it's a stamped asphalt that looks like brick. So yeah, it's the same kind of pattern throughout the downtown area. Whenever we have done new projects, we've tried to apply that.
Mm-hmm. And I think that brick pavers could probably work for you in more of the downtown core area where traffic's going a little bit slower. But here, because it is such a wide and big intersection, I would advise you to consider those high visibility continental stripe markings on the crosswalks instead. I think there's also some concern that over time the stamped concrete or the brick pavers, they might wear down unevenly, might become less ADA compliant over time, just be a less even surface for pedestrians and wheelchairs. But even apart from that context, there's the visibility aspect where when it's raining, just the color of the stamped concrete is going to wash out a little bit over time. It's not going to be as visible to pedestrians as the continental crosswalk markings, just the high visibility crosswalk markings. So certainly something to consider. And yeah, I think anything you can do to narrow that path or break it up and then add that missing crosswalk across the southern leg. So where right now you're forcing pedestrians to cross to the north and come back to the south possibly, I think that would be a location to consider adding that missing leg of the crosswalk. Robert's asking if there's a way to divert eastbound Hartsville Pike traffic to turn off US 31 earlier at 109 or later at Airport Road, and would that reduce turning volume enough to facilitate a road diet or pedestrian downtown? That's certainly something to consider, right? If there's a heavy right turning movement here, is it necessary? If you were to road diet this section, would it kind of force some of the drivers to detour to a different location to take a right turn if you make it more difficult for them?
Yeah, we are looking at that. We are looking at a project that's a long-term project to improve Smith Street, which is parallel to that road, Highway 25, that would peel off of Highway 31 just southwest of the image here, which could divert some of that right turning movement traffic out of that intersection and have it use Smith Street instead. That's a project that we have in our comp plan, and we just need some money from the MPO to make that happen.
Daniel, you can snap your fingers and make that happen, right? Some change in the MTP budget, possibly.
Yeah, so I mean that could happen. I suppose that it would slow traffic down, but you could take out the free-flowing right turn and bring that up to a stop condition and a permissive right turn. But then you'd have a difficulty because of the angle there accommodating trucks. So trucks, we don't like trucks to use this route coming into town, but they do occasionally. They do have deliveries, and it's kind of tough on them right now with the way that intersection is for them to be able to negotiate that. We have delineators to try to separate the lanes for a short distance from that east side. So certainly that creates another problem. And there's really, because of the alignments of the road and setting up turn lanes, there's not really an opportunity to put a mid-block crossing and have an area in between the lanes that would accommodate those crossers. I guess those lanes are probably 11 feet wide at best as you travel down through there, and there's just not much opportunity. There's not much right of way.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you could probably still consider a mid-block crossing in combination with a pedestrian hybrid beacon, even if a median refuge island were not possible. But if you start by considering some sort of road diet element for this block between 31 East and North Locust Avenue, maybe at least for part of that stretch, then certainly the road diet would help you with any sort of mid-block crossing design, make it a little bit easier.
Yeah, there's only about 200 feet or so between these blocks. They're not real long, 2 to 3. Yeah, about I'd say 200 feet.
Yeah, I think that's one of the advantages of this this site is that you do seem to have the basics of a street grid network. So at least for trucks and other vehicles, they can find alternate routes, right? If there was just like only one way east-west to get into downtown here, then you'd be more in trouble. But with having alternative routes, even if they might not be always preferred by truck drivers, it's good to know that if you make some conditions slightly more difficult for them here, people can choose to reroute via other routes. So yeah, having that street network, the grid, certainly is a big helping factor. I think in Memphis at the workshop we were talking about one location where they were having such huge volumes at one intersection because there really was no other way to get from that kind of suburban development to this key arterial route. So having a grid network is your friend right here.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not that much of a diversion for people to use the sidewalks and the marked crosswalks with the push buttons to get to their destination. It's just that some folks are just more inclined to go from one straight line to another, or one point to another on a straight line, and they're because of the volumes of traffic here.
Well, and they might not feel super safe trying to cross that slip right turn lane either, right? So I think that's part of that is what's the alternative? You kind of risk trying to cross mid-block without any signal or pedestrian refuge island, or you still feel like maybe you're risking your life trying to cross across this slip lane. So I think giving people a more comfortable environment to cross would certainly help encourage them in that direction. So yeah, sounds like you have some interesting challenges to deal with here, right? But I would suggest look at all of the above, right? Look at how to improve crossings at this existing signalized intersection to add the missing leg, and whether or not it's possible to add some road diet elements in another mid-block crossing.
I think the next two slides, if we only got 2 minutes, show a street view that you can maybe have a different perspective if they got included. Here's looking westbound on Highway 25. You see the Wendy's. And this is fairly light traffic conditions. This is not typical. So you can see the approach there is at Cemetery as you're looking westbound there towards the major intersection. And you can see the difficulty that we have trying to accommodate that. I don't personally see a lot of people cutting across there. I have seen people cut across there. That's looking the other direction, but I don't see a ton. You can see the delineators I was talking about that accommodate the free flow right. That red car there is just coming off the free flow right. But all of these people that come on the left lane of the delineators that are heading eastbound towards Wendy's all those cars are not thinking about pedestrians. They're thinking about being able to get over in the right lane because they have to. So that's what they're thinking. They're not looking for pedestrians, and they certainly don't want to stop after they've come through that intersection for a flashing beacon, a couple hundred feet up the road there. So maybe the best thing to do is just find a way to prohibit cross traffic. And I'm not just talking about pedestrians. I'm talking about vehicles crossing across there too, because it's very congested and there's a lot of weaving movements and queues that are backing up in really both directions here.
Well, this is an interesting example. Thanks so much for bringing it for us to discuss today, Bill. Appreciate all your time and everybody's time and attention joining us for this workshop. Again, if you added your name and agency to the chat box, we will provide a listing of attendance to the local hosts, and Daniel can help share it with everybody so you can self-register for PDH credits if you need to. It sounds like some of those conversations will need to continue beyond the the scope of the workshop today, but again, we appreciate all your time and the feedback. This has been some interesting discussions today, much more interactive than yesterday. So again, thanks so much.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to get all the summary, if it's possible, of all of the comments. Is that possible, Daniel?
Yes, definitely. I also recorded both days, and so I can send those out as well.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you all. Thanks, Daniel, and thank you, Peter and Jessica, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Great job.
Looking forward to the new MUTCD coming out at some point, so we'll have some new fun facts to discuss after that.
Yeah, and everybody should get their comments in now. So
that's right.
I don't know if you've actually there was a webinar that America Walks did. I don't know if you were able to view that. The title of it was The Notorious MUTCD, which, yeah, definitely got some attention, I think, of some folks. So, yeah, it's challenging. I know how different groups, we want to make progress, and I think we are, but it doesn't go as quickly for some as others. But yeah, we push the envelope, and but it's definitely challenging for engineers and planners and everybody to try to balance all of these things. But I think we're moving in the right direction, and yeah, we'll see where that goes. So hopefully in the next, I don't know when that's supposed to when they'll have all the comments and everything done, but we'll probably have to do a lot of revisions to the the training based upon the new wording and guidance and such. So
sounds good. We'll stay tuned.
All right. Take care.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
And I guess actually I'll stay on if there's any questions. I don't know if anyone else, Keith,